Hello and welcome back to Zenin Fanfics. Today we're starting part 49 of an exciting series. What if Villain Deku became a teacher at U.A? If you enjoy this video, please like and subscribe for more content. The story we're featuring is written by Bloomer Bill on Fanfiction.net. You can find all the relevant links in the description, so be sure to check out the author's profile and say hello. Now let's dive into the story. Achiko wasn't really paying attention as she rushed past the trees. She just knew that her BLD felt like it was on fire, and her lungs were aching by the time she stopped. The frantic beat of her heart was drowning out everything except for her panting as her fists shook at her sides, fighting back from crying. She shouldn't cry over that, but her legs threatened to buckle underneath her from running as far as she had without breathing as much as she should have. But Achiko refused to allow them to do so. She wouldn't give Bakugo the privilege of falling to her knees and falling apart on the forest floor over him. She couldn't believe that she ever thought of someone like that as her friend, that Bakugo was actually Izuku's friend. He wasn't even that nice to anyone, and still he somehow tricked her. Tricked all of them. Achiko kicked a boulder and sent and flying into a tree and wanted to scream the dozens of curses that she learned from the Southsiders at the top of her lungs. Instead, she just ended up looking up to the sky and trying not to cry. "Yukai," Gigi said as he and Awaken entered the same clearing she stumbled upon. He moved to come closer, maybe hug her, but stopped midway as a fourth person came into the clearing. Izuku apparently was not that far behind them. He timidly entered, fidgeting with the end of his scarf as he nervously met her gaze. "Why?" she croaked, traitorous tears threatening to fall from her eyes. Izuku's mouth opened before it closed, a conflicted look passing o'er his face. "Why would you let us meet with him? Why didn't you tell us about what he did to you?" she questioned, throwing her arms around. Izuku's eyes fell to the ground. "Because I didn't want you guys to hate him," Izuku quietly answered. "Hate him?" Achiko spat in disbelief. "Of course we should hate him. He hurt you, Izuku." Achiko shouted back. "I know." Izuku muttered, one hand holding onto his arm. "Izuku, he could have killed you. He did put you in the hospital." Achiko all but screamed, stomping her foot. "Why would you ever let someone like that back into your life, Izuku?" she exclaimed, her anger reaching a peak, and finally tears spilled over and fell from her eyes. Izuku raised his head. "Because he wouldn't let me forgive him," Izuku answered sadly. "Forgive him?" Achiko hissed, completely taken aback, and stared at the boy across from her in disbelief. Eyes a-dash, she tried to protest, but Izuku interrupted her. "I know I shouldn't, Yukai. I know I should hate him, that I should have completely cut him out of my life and never looked back, because that's what I would have told my students to do if they were in my situation." Izuku yelled back at her, frustration clear on his face as tears pricked his eyes. Because more often than not, abusers will never change and only continue to hurt you. They will just lie that they will until you forgive them and then guilt you if you ever bring it up again. Izuku told her, waving his own arms in his highly emotional state. "But Katsuki will not let me forgive him, even though I would in a heartbeat," Izuku shouted, sniffing as tears welled up and poured down his cheeks. "He refuses to let anyone minimize what he did to me. Especially not me, since he knows that I would give less of a F what he did to hurt me otherwise. Katsuki won't let me forgive him because he knows that what he did to me was unforgivable, Yukai," Izuku ranted. "And he never wants to be that person ever again. That's why he tells people who he used to be about the things he did to me, because he wants people to hold him accountable, Yukai. So he never backslides back into one of the people that made my life hell," Izuku exclaimed, stomping his foot and his chest heaving. The four falling silent as she, Awakuin, and Gigi just stared at Izuku, having never had him yell at them before instead of the gangs. Zuri and Awaken muttered timidly, placing a hand on Izuku's shoulder as he cried. "I understand if you can't stand to be around him anymore, or that you never want to see Katsuki again. That is your choice, and I will never begrudge you that. I won't be disappointed or upset with any of you," Izuku told them, much calmer now. "But please respect that I want to keep Katsuki in my life, that I still want him to be one of my friends despite everything that happened between us," Izuku said as he wiped away his tears. I know that it might not be healthy for me to keep someone like him in my life, even if he's changed, but that is still a choice that I need to make, and if Katsuki does become worse again, then I won't hesitate to kick his butt and put a bullet in him if I have to," Izuku insisted, even going so far as to pull out his gun. Achiko wanted to argue, but she wasn't sure what she could say right now. Though she was too emotional at the moment to actually argue or really think about anything at the moment. "I think we need to all go back home right now. For all of us to cool our heads and think about everything," Awakuin cautiously suggested, his voice thick as he looked between her and Izuku. "Yes, that would probably be for the best," Gigi agreed, moving over to her side, and carefully wrapped his hand around her own. Achiko felt the urge to pull her hand out of Gigi's and to insist on continuing. But for as emotional as she felt, she also felt drained. So she took a shaky breath and opened her hand so she could properly hold Gigi's hand. "Okay," she relented, feeling like she swallowed something bitter or sour for giving in so easily. "I'll show you out of the forest," Izuku told them, putting his gun away and then walking away. The three of them quietly following him out of the woods. Izuku silent the whole way, though Achiko didn't feel up to talking herself. Even when they got to the edge of the woods, she couldn't really find any words that wouldn't cause them to start fighting again, even if she was less upset. Achiko was still angry, but she didn't want to fight about it right now either. So, she just left with Awakuin and Gigi to the train station. Later that night, Achiko was much calmer as she sat on her bed in her PJs, feeling more gutted than anything else in the moment as she fell backwards and stared at her ceiling. She had been trying to wrap her head around what had happened and why she had reacted so strongly. Okay, maybe strongly was the wrong choice of words considering she only broke Bakuga's nose and stormed off. A lot of people that knew Izuku would have done worse than that to him. But that was the first time she had punched someone in earnest. Threats of violence had become normalish in their friend group when it came to protecting the others. That didn't change her disbelief with herself for breaking someone's nose. In retrospect, she had to admit she really would not have taken the news well at all. Because she liked Bakugo, he seemed so cool to hang out with before, and she loved hanging out with someone that just seemed to get how burned by the world she felt at times. So now, knowing that he was one of the people that hurt someone so dear to her, just left her blindsided and overwhelmed with her anger and betrayal. Achiko did not regret breaking Bakuga's nose. She did feel bad about yelling and demanding answers from Izuku after she stormed off. She could have been more tactful and just talk about it with him later, when her emotions weren't yanking her around. As for how she felt about knowing Bakugo had gone from Izuku's best friend since BRTH to one of his abusers, and then back to his friend somehow, part of her just couldn't wrap her head around it. She had been bullied before, still kind of wish she just didn't pay as much attention to them, but she couldn't see herself being friendly with them. Well, maybe she would later in life, but that would strongly depend on the circumstances behind why they bullied her and if they apologized to her. But she would never be more than civil to someone that physically bullied her. And the farthest her bullies went was sneaking those dumb notes in her backpack and talking behind her back. Bakuga, though, he told them flat out that he could have killed Izuku and hurt him so horribly that Izuku had to go to the hospital. If someone had done that to her, she couldn't even fathom how someone could overlook that and continue to hang out with someone like that, or even be as comfortable as Izuku was with Bakuga now. Sure, Izuku wasn't hanging off Bakuga's arm, or laying on him like he would lay on them, but there was almost no hesitation when Izuku interacted with Bakugo and he happily chat with and sat next to Bakugo, especially someone who wouldn't even apologize. Achiko groaned into her hands. A knock on her door made Achiko blink, and she reached around for her phone to check the time. Her parents were working late tonight over in another prefecture and wouldn't be home for another hour. A chill crept up her spine as she realized that. Achiko moved immediately, grabbed her pocket knife, and got to her feet, moving to the corner, and locked her eyes on the door. Her body was tense as she prepared herself for just about anything. Another knock came from the door. Yukai, are you still up?" Awakuin's voice came from the other side of the door. Achiko hesitated for a moment, then used her phone to call Awakuin and was relieved when she heard his phone on the other side of the door too. Oh my god. Achiko thought, going over to the door and opened to indeed see Awakuin, and she immediately punched his shoulder. You butt. You scare the hell out of me. Achiko hissed at him. Awakuin quickly raised his arms in surrender. I'm sorry. I tried knocking at the front door, but you didn't answer that or your phone. Awakuin apologized, shrinking away slightly. Achiko frowned and checked her phone, and after checking saw a couple of missed calls she missed because she set her phone to do not disturb earlier and hadn't turned it off. There were also texts warning her that he'd come over to check on her that she hadn't read or seen. You did, she admitted, pinching the bridge of her nose. How'd you even get in our apartment? Achiko questioned. Oh, well, you guys don't have a chain lock or bolt, and I've been learning to pick locks from some of the Southside kids. Awakuin bashfully explained, rubbing the back of his neck. I'll talk with my parents about getting one of those, Achiko replied, suddenly feeling a bit uneasy knowing the door could be lockpicked by anyone. She'd put something in front of the door for now. Moving the couch would not be that strong. Yeah, you probably should. Again, I'm so sorry for scaring the SHD out of you, but I wanted to see if you wanted to talk about earlier. Awakuin asked her. Achiko bit her lip and leaned against her door frame. Kind of, Achiko confessed, hugging herself. It would probably do her best to actually talk things out with someone instead of running circles in her own head. Come on, we can talk in the kitchen and have jelly pouches. Achiko offered, pushing off her door's frame, and moved to the kitchen area, digging out a couple of pouches for herself and Awakuin. So, what Bakuga told us was pretty F up, Awakuin said after having a little bit of his pouch. It was majority F up, Awakuin, Achiko corrected. Awakuin's eyes fell to the counter where his arms was resting. Yeah, it was, Awakuin conceded, burying one of his hands in his hair. Is it wrong? I want to give him a chance? Awakuin asked timidly as his eyes met hers again. Achiko stared at him taken aback, and Awakuin held his hands up. I know it sounds bad, Awakuin told her hurriedly. But it's just, Awakuin tried to defend himself before burying his head in his hands. We hang out with all kinds of people in the Southside, Yukai. I've seen the guy that trains you how to fight with weapons deal drags, and I'm 50% sure that the small lady I helped with her groceries last week killed her husband and got away with it, Awakuin said with his hands moving as he spoke. Achiko couldn't deny that. She had probably talked with a lot of killers when she was asking around the gangs for someone to teach her. And some of the people there were pretty open with how bad they were, and sometimes they didn't bother hiding what they did for money when they came around. And some part of me can't help but call me a demon hypocrite if I just F off when we hang out with worse bastards that don't want to change, when Bakugo has been actively trying and ain't a son of a beach anymore, Awakuin told her, with his hand going back to his hair and gripping it. Awakuin, Achiko softly said as she put her hand on his. I mean, I know the F or won't apologize for what he did to Zuri, but he doesn't feel like the flaming BSTRD does Yukai, Awakuin said, continuing to rant about it, looking conflicted as he did. Endeavor ain't apologizing because he is a son of beach that doesn't even care, and no doubt a hateful BSTRD on top of everything else, but I think I can understand why Bakugo won't apologize to Zuri, Awakuin elaborated with both of his arms resting on the table. I mean, there are times when you're going to F up, and if you F up bad enough, it feels like there ain't enough words to express just how much you know you F up. But you do know that you really can't make up for the CRP you did either, right? Awakuin told her, trying his best to explain himself. Achiko couldn't help nodding. She remembered how she accidentally broke one of her parents' wedding gifts, a handmade dish set from one of her great-grandmothers. It was one of the few things that they hadn't sold off to pay the bills, and Achiko felt so incredibly bad about it since there was no way to replace it. She hid the shards and made and thrown away dozens of cards, trying to say just how sorry she was for breaking it. The two were hardly comparable in severity, but it was the only thing Achiko could think of in the moment. And like, F, how could you actually apologize for the CRP Bakuga did? Awakuin asked her, looking at her at a loss. Achiko's mouth opened and closed, and she hung her head. You really couldn't, Achiko realized. So, it's kind of mature or something to acknowledge that he screwed up to that level and refused to let Zuri say it was water under the bridge, or some SHD, Awakuin said, and Achiko wished she didn't agree with him, because she still wanted to be angry, but she had to admit that with Awakuin's words that she couldn't think of Bakugo as badly as before. Even in the height of her anger with him, Achiko hadn't compared Bakugo to endeavor, even if there could be a kind of parallel, since he was the reason she lost a lot of her hero worship in a pretty dramatic way that was personally painful. And even now, still very angry with Bakugo, she couldn't exactly see the two of them being comparable. And when we hung out with him, he was a prick, sure, but he and Zuri seemed to be okay with what they were, and Bakugo never overstepped any boundaries or did anything that seemed cruel to Zuri. Awakuin pointed out, then sighed. So, even though I know I should hate him on principle, and I won't forget what he did to Zuri, I at least want to give him a chance to do something, prove he ain't so much of a bestiarity. I don't know. Awakuin told her, burying his head in his hands. Achiko's eyes fell to the table. As she thought about it, the idea wasn't quite comfortable to her, but without the blind anger, she had to admit she didn't feel nearly as strictly opposed to the idea as before. She sighed and face-bombed. If you wanna, then you can, Awakuin. Achiko begrudgingly told him. Awakuin's head shot up, staring at her surprised. Really? You're okay with me still hanging out with Bakugo? He asked her, confused and a little stunned. I have a lot of anger over what he did, and that was mainly because he didn't seem like a bully before and I was blindsided, Achiko confessed, rubbing a circle into her jelly pouch. Maybe I'll feel different about this all later. I might come around to being where you are emotionally, or I might never want to see him again. Right now, though, I'd deck him strong enough to lose teeth if we were in the same room again, Achiko said, just a bit unsure over how she would feel a week from now. However, if you want to, then you can go and see him with Izuku. Achiko assured him, I can't control how you feel about this, and trying to wouldn't be healthy. Achiko commented. Awakuin looked relieved and smiled at her, understanding how painful the words were for her to say at the moment from the way she knew her face was scrunched up. Thanks, Yukai, he muttered. Achiko shook her head and stood up, giving him a hug, and muttered, it's no problem, then pulled away and placed a hand on his shoulder. But Awakuin, if you ever break into my house again, I will not hesitate to stab you for it, Achiko said, making sure to grip his shoulder tightly. Awakuin chuckled uneasily, a bead of sweat forming on his forehead. No problem, Yukai. Not my best decision, Awakuin admitted, rubbing the back of his head. Looks like a cinnamon roll would kill you. Achiko Uraraka looks like they'd kill you, is a cinnamon roll. Mizo Shoji looks like a cinnamon roll, is a cinnamon roll. Yosetsu Aways looks like they'd kill you, would kill you. Izuku Midoriya Tamaki supposed he shouldn't have been surprised when he exploded into a cloud of smoke during his training with Izawa-sensei. Despite only starting to get good at using float after 3 days of training, the active use of inheritance must have helped it further settle within him and Nijire. So, it would be natural that another of the past holders' quirks would pop up. Tamaki even made sure to review what their quirks were again with Nijire, mainly to ease his nerves that they wouldn't have any more surprises like Float had been. And there was even their dream last night to forewarn them that another quirk was going to show up. Last night, when they woke in the reef, along with the more abundancy life, he and Nijire had tales of all things. Long, WHP-like things with the barb of a stingray at the end. That really should have been the thing that tipped him off to what was going to happen. But no, Smokescreen had crept up on him just like Float had, only showing up when Izawa-sensei tackled him from behind, and like instinct the purple smoke came out of him, making the two of them scramble to untangle themselves. Unfortunately, learning to turn Smokescreen off wasn't as easy as Float. He'd had some experience in manipulating his body, but his control of it was harder to hold when he was panicked. It was a quirk born from a defensive line of evolution, so that really should have been clear. But while leaving small trails of purple smoke behind him wasn't fun, he'd been surprised that Nijire had more trouble with the quirk than he did. Part of him wanted to chalk it up to her quirk not being as physical as his own, and therefore unpracticed. However, he also feared that Nijire had the same problem because she shared some of his anxiety from somewhere or some reason. Then again, Nijire might not be taking the evil overlord after them now, as well as he previously thought. That would be a major point of stress that could get to anyone. The appearance of Black Whip a couple of days later was the first one they managed to predict. The tentacles on Yagi, Nana, and En's forms now on them as well, for on them each and attached to their shoulders. So, when they woke up that day, Nijire happily called ahead for them about another quirk that was going to pop up. Nijire was the one to use Black Whip first, having volunteered to try and find out which one they had now. After a little playing around, Black Whip came forth, And then Tamaki was learning to manipulate the black curls of energy with Nijire's help, which was kind of like moving his fingers when he turned them into tentacles. And after picking that up so quickly, Nijire insisted on the two of them sparring in the gym they trained Float in. Come on, Jiki. It'll be fun, and what better way to get used to our new quirks than by sparring with them? Nijire told him as she dragged him to the gym. Tamaki knew better than to argue. She was right, and Deku-Sensei would be there to supervise them and give aid if something unexpected happened. So now, Tamaki stood across from a bouncing Nijire in the middle of foam-wrapped obstacle course. Deku-Sensei held up his hand. Okay, I trust the two of you not to maul each other, but try to keep from breaking any bones. So no using the strength enhancer Hado, and the first to pin the other for 15 seconds is the winner. If that is not met in 5 minutes, the spar is a draw. Deku-Sensei explained to them. Tamaki's ears drooped at the unintentional reminder of what happened when they had tried to tap into the strength enhancer. Nijire had taken to it like a fish to water, her energy quirk all about managing power input and output, so she was able to safely use up to 5% of the enhancer. He himself, though, had made the mistake of trying to focus that strength into his hand like whenever he used his BRTH quirk, and he had broken his hand as a result. And his only saving grace was that he stopped before causing himself any damage that would need surgery to fix. Recovery Girl still threatened to whack him upside the head if he tried to do that ever again, and Tamaki really didn't want her to do that or yell at him again, so he'd hold off on using the enhancer for now. There were plenty of other quirks that he needed to train with, so he could set the enhancer to the side for now. It wasn't like he was neglecting his physical training in the process. Do both of you understand? Deku-Sensei asked. We got it, Deku-Sensei. Nijire cheered with a fist up in the air, while he just nodded. All right then, both of you get set, Deku-Sensei instructed. Nijire took on one of the stances that Izawa-sensei had taught her, while Tamaki dropped to stand on all fours. Ready, Deku-Sensei said, glancing between them, before he swung his hand down and exclaimed, Go! Without thinking, Tamaki leapt into the air after forcing the pulse of float to become stronger, dodging the float-aided tackle that Nijire had tried to do, Nijire whirling around to look up at him a second later. Drawing energy from his core, he shoot out a single WHP out from the back of his hand. Tamaki threw himself through and around the structures in an attempt to outrun Nijire, which was actually working out for him so far. His training in the forest came in handy, as he'd become far more used to taking sharp turns in close spaces and aware of the stuff around him if he didn't want to slam himself into trees. Nijire was not used to having to slow down to keep from crashing into the structures. He would not be able to outrun her forever, though. He'd need to do something to allow him to pin her, something that was much harder to do knowing that Nijire had been training with Izawa-sensei to grapple. Tamaki could try to tie her up with Black Whip, but he'd need to get in close enough to do that, and he'd risk her doing the same if he didn't take her by surprise. Looking up to the rafters, there were some of the ribbons they had moved around them for training, and he shot up for them, ripping out a couple of them once he reached for them. Seeing Nijire approaching, he immediately released a cloud of smoke to blind her, waiting for her to blow through the cloud before dropping from the sky and to sneak away into one of the larger structures. Knowing he wouldn't have long, Tamaki was quick to begin setting up the ribbons, then tucking himself away up in a corner of the ceiling. It was easier to do with float helping to keep him up, but staying upside down would become troublesome if he had to stay like this for a long time. Thankfully, though, Nijire flew through the hall not too long afterwards and exclaimed "Ga" as she ran into the ribbons. Not wasting the moment, Tamaki leaped and used Black Whip, 3 coils of energy coming out of him and rushing to wrap them around Nijire. Oof! Nijire grunted as the two of them hit the ground. Tamaki quickly placing his hands like he would for a struggling deer. Her arms were very well pinned, so he made sure that his knee was pressed strong to one of her knees, and that his free hand would keep her head in place. MMPF, Nijire grumbled, trying to wiggle somewhat under him, then huffed, sounding more amused than he thought she would in this moment. This is a good pin, Jiki, Nijire happily told him, and Tamaki flushed slightly. It was high praise knowing that she had been training with Izawa-sensei so much. But you should remember to get all of my limbs next time, Nijire said before moving her free leg upwards and released a massive golden spiral, destroying the roof of the structure. Tamaki's eyes widened, and he released Nijire to throw himself out a window and not get crushed under the falling equipment. Nijire flying after him and starting another chase throughout the gym. Nijire being able to catch up, and the two of them fell out of the sky and began to tussle on the ground. He tried his best to keep from being fully pinned. He was nearly as strong as Nijire was, but she clearly had more experience here, and there was only so much he could do with only the hunting he'd done allowing him to keep from being fully pinned. He even had gone as far as to bite her arm, not strong enough to break skin, but it still shook Nijire enough to let Tamaki flip them around once again, and he could try to pin her again. Okay, the match is over. It's a draw. Deku-Sensei shouted as he ran over to them. Tamaki unclenched his jaw, releasing Nijire's arm, and moved to stand up, then offered his hand to her and pulled her up to her feet. Nijire giggling, bouncing slightly from her giddiness. That was so much fun, Jiki. Like, I know neither of us won, but we totally need to do that more. Nijire proclaimed with a sparkle in her eyes. Tamaki bashfully nodded, rubbing his arm since it was cramping somewhat. There was just something about using inheritance to play tag or spar like just now that felt nice. Which was a weird thought to have for him, at least. Normally things like this were scary even when he did them with friends. Not a bad kind of weird, but still weird. You both did so good out there. Deku-Sensei praised once he reached them, beaming a megawatt smile. Especially with Black Whip. You both have taken to it so naturally. Deku-Sensei told them before pulling out a tablet and happily showing them, both moving around using both Black Whip and Float. I know, right? And Black Whip and Float need so much energy when used together. It didn't even feel that bad when Jiki pinned me, and I couldn't move. Nijire cheerfully declared both of her hands, shooting into the air with her excitement. Tamaki felt his stomach twist slightly at the reminder he and the others pinning her used to be so uncomfortable for her. Nijire insisted that it was all right, and that it wasn't like it ever did get to the point she felt like bursting, so he shouldn't torment himself over it. At this rate, I might even be able to read while just kicking my feet again. Nijire added gleefully, holding her interlocked hands to her chest with sheer delight that Tamaki couldn't help feeling some of it as well. Nijire had once told him of her love of reading, and how she wished she could do it again, but her quirk got in the way of it, something that was clearly going to change soon now that she had inheritance. Deku-Sensei nodded, just as happy for Nijire. Speaking of your development, considering the time between quirks is getting shorter, most likely the last 3 will show themselves this week. Deku-Sensei predicted, changing the tablet screen to a small graph he'd made, showing when they got inheritance and the arrivals of each of the users' quirks, with the time in between indeed growing shorter and shorter with each one. Then that means we'll have enough time to train with inheritance to still be able to take the provisional with everyone in September. Yay! Nijire cheered and clapped. Tamaki, though, felt his brain pause as he remembered that it was still July, not even a full month since he had taken inheritance along with Nijire. But it felt like it had been so much longer than that. Had he and Nijire really learned how to control and use 3 new quirks back-to-back in less than 2 weeks? However, upon remembering the day and month, Tamaki made another realization that made his heart drop. Mirio's birthday is in 3 days, and I haven't gotten him any yet. Tamaki muttered, clutching his head, wondering how in the world he could have nearly forgotten Mirio's birthday. Nijire gasped herself, Mirio-chan's birthday. We need to have a big party and lots of presidents. And Nijire began to ramble only to pause and put her hands on Deku-Sensei's shoulders. Deku-Sensei, if we promise to avoid the cameras, could we egg and TP Sir's agency? She asked very seriously. Deku-Sensei sighed, tired but fond. Then a mischievous look passed over his face, and he smiled. If you can get Aizawa-sensei to watch over you while doing it, then yes, you can TP his house. No egging, though. That's just a waste of good food that could be used to feed someone else. Deku-Sensei answered. Nijire nodded sagely. Understood. I shall text the others we ride at dawn. Nijire promised. And you don't need to worry about planning a big party either. Togata-san has already arranged something with me, so just make sure to bring a coat and whatever presents you're going to get him. Deku-Sensei added a moment later. Nijire merely looked excited at the thought and tried to pepper him with questions over the party Togata-san and Deku-Sensei had planned. Tamaki, though, was lost in his mind, wondering just what he should get Mirio. A card wouldn't feel right, and he wasn't sure just what he could get Mirio on such short notice either. But he had to get Mirio something good. Mirio deserved to get something really nice this time after everything that had happened in the last couple of months. But what? It had to be something big, really big that could be helpful to Mirio in some way. After a moment, though, the memory of how he and Mirio became friends came to mind, and then how their friendship had grown in the coming days. That memory had given Tamaki an idea, but it was rather wild to try to pull something like that off on such short notice. Then the day before the sports festival came to mind, and all of the dozens of plushies and banners in the hall. Timidly, Tamaki stepped forward and tugged on Deku-Sensei's shirt, interrupting Nijire's barrage of questions. "Yes, Amajiki-san," Deku-Sensei asked him, curious. Tamaki ducked his head, and his fingers fidgeted with each other as he gathered up the courage to ask, "Did you think you could help me with Mirio's present?" Deku-Sensei smiled gently to him, nodding and softly asked, "What do you have in mind?" Izawa, getting ready to train the energy gremlin Nijire * tackles him. "Sensei. Sensei. Sensei." Izawa, twitching. "What problem, child?" Nijire, holding his shoulders. "Deku-Sensei will give us permission to TP Sir's house if you supervise us." Izawa. "Nijire, are you down?" Izawa. "How many times?" Nijire. "Yes." Izawa, the original poster child for spite. "This is acceptable. I will meet you after patrol with Yamada's stash." Nijire cackles chaotically. Izuku probably should not have been surprised that his birthday would cause so many waves by this point. But waking up to find that all of his coworkers had sent him a bunch of happy birthday texts and promising to give him the gifts they bought him when school was up again made him show his phone to his mother. He had honestly thought that in his earlier morning delirium that he had hallucinated the texts, only for his mother to tear up and congratulate Izuku on having such wonderful coworkers, which in turn made Izuku start crying. His favorite heroes had gone out of their way to get him birthday gifts. He hadn't even had his morning tea, and he was already crying today. Why did everyone have to be so invested in his birthday, gosh dang it? It was bad enough that the people in the district spent time and money either making something for him or getting him something they knew he'd like. Now his coworkers were doing it too. Shaking his head, he helped his mom put the food on the table so that they could have breakfast before he left for work, and his mom started to get everything ready for his birthday party with his friends. Izuku dimmed slightly thinking about them. Awakuen had been willing to hang out with Katsuki again a couple of days after Katsuki confessed about their full history. And it was awkward, but at least it didn't feel like Awakuen was only there to watch over Katsuki. Yukai and Gigi hadn't spoken with Katsuki or met up with him, and Izuku really didn't begrudge them for that. He absolutely understood where they were coming from, even if it hurt to not be able to see all of his friends at the same time. Gigi had privately asked him more about what had happened between him and Katsuki, and the two of them talked about it in late-night phone calls. Izuku had spilled a lot about the bullying Katsuki had done, including explaining that was where he got the name Deku-Sensei from, since that was almost exclusively what Katsuki used to call him. Gigi had let him ramble on and on about it sometimes. Izuku really hoped that it meant that Gigi might be coming around about Katsuki, though he wouldn't force Gigi to, and if nothing else it was probably good to have someone outside of his family know more about it. His mom, ruffling his hair, brought him out of his thoughts, and he made sure to hug her before texting Kirojiri to get to the district he was working in that day, and texting with Joseph to make sure that everything was ready for Togata's birthday in a couple of hours. Happily pocketing his phone when he got a confirmation text, though he made sure he texted Kirojiri about when he'd need to open a portal at the Togata's apartment. Knowing what Amajiki's gift was going to be, Izuku was sure Togata would never forget today for the rest of his life. If someone ever gave him something like that, Izuku just wouldn't know what he'd do with himself. Mirio had been looking forward to his birthday. Well, he always looked forward to his birthday. When he was younger, his dad would take the day off, and the two of them went out and did something together for the first time before coming back home and baking a cake together. And once he became friends with Sunny, they'd take him along and then have a sleepover either at his place or Sunny's. And last year was a complete blast since they had enough people this time around to do some bigger group activities with Nijire, Yu, Miyake, and Oz around now. This year wouldn't disappoint either. Normally his dad didn't really tell him what plans he'd made for him, the surprise being half the fun for Mirio, but with his recent slump his dad wanted to check in and see if he wanted to have a party at all. Mirio was glad his dad wanted to check in, because when Mirio did think about it, he couldn't say he wanted something so high energy like they normally did. So, his dad suggested making the cake first this year, then taking them all to the sheep farm that Deku-Sensei took him to, maybe catching a train to go, and do a walk though one of the local trails before supper at a small ramen shop. He absolutely adored the idea, even though his dad was hesitant to suggest it at first. When he asked about that, his dad explained that he didn't want Mirio to feel pressured to let them into a space that he'd claimed for himself as a safe space. Mirio had to hug his dad after that and tell him he was the best dad he could have ever asked for. Deku-Sensei's farm had become a safe space for him, with him going with Deku-Sensei there to talk about the feelings he had that he didn't feel ready to share with Inu-san yet. And maybe if his dad asked a week ago about bringing his friends there, then Mirio probably would not have agreed to taking his friends there. However, with the sheep, near everyday therapy and support he was getting at all sides, Mirio felt okay with sharing a place that made him feel safe enough to confess a lot of his darker thoughts. His friends could use some time with the sheep too, and he loved the idea of taking them around Hokkaido and exploring a little of the separated island with all of his friends before having a bowl of ramen with them. So, he was pretty pumped once July 15th finally came and had accidentally woken Sunny up with him. But his friend wasn't upset with him. Sunny even helped him, and his dad baked the cake. Orange Blossom had been the one they made this year, and it would probably have good icing if nothing else. And if it was more tart than sweet, then they could give the rest to the workers since they would know what to do with it. Sunny helping his dad smooth out the white icing before letting him spread the crushed candied orange peels. It looked great, and they had finished it right before everyone else had arrived. Nijire, of course, jumped at him with a hug, and she was carrying whatever present she got for him in a big, colorful bag hidden by the tissue paper. "Happy birthday, Mirio-chan," Nijire cheered while he hugged her back. Yu and Miyake entered after her, each carrying gifts of their own for him. "Happy birthday, Mirio." Yu said, her voice a bit weary, which made sense since she looked the most bothered wearing her thick coat. "Thanks, guys. Don't worry about the heat for much longer. We'll be leaving in a few minutes," Mirio promised, letting go of Nijire. Yu looking extremely relieved. "We better SDRPR. I ain't fixing to melt today." Oz grumbled, moving to enter as well, a box under his arm. "So where are we going to go, Mirio-chan? Haha." Nijire questioned, a slight bounce in her step as she followed him over to the kitchen area. "You'll see soon enough, Nijire-chan. Want to help me box up the cake? I don't want anything to land in it," Mirio requested, and she was more than happy to help him. Sunny and Oz briefly shared a look before Sunny crossed the distance and showed him his phone. And Mirio couldn't help beaming when he saw the two of them getting along, then helped Nijire tie a ribbon on the boxed-up cake. "Will we have cake or open presents first once we get there?" Miyake inquired, fanning Yu with his tail. "Presents," Mirio answered before he noticed the wisps of black and purple mist. "Oh, that's our ride over there," Mirio told them. Aside from his dad and Miyake, the others stared wide-eyed at the portal. Miyake, merely thrilled. "I was wondering how we would get to Hokkaido and back before tomorrow. Deku-Sensei asked the person with the teleportation quirk to take us there and back." Miyake asked him. "Yep, it's how Deku-Sensei's been taking me out and about for our talks." Mirio happily confirmed with a nod of his head. "Is that really safe?" Yu asked, looking at the floating flat oval from both sides, slightly dubious. "Totally. You just have to hold your breath, and it will be fine. Well, you might get a bit dizzy if you aren't used to being so weightless or massless, really," Mirio commented with his hand on his chin. "Deku-Sensei uses this quirk every day to get to work and the districts all over Japan, then to the place he's staying for the night." Miyake informed them if it was not safe, then he would not permit us to think about using this way of travel. Miyake further elaborated. "It is, and we should move quickly, since we can't expect them to keep the portal open for us forever," his dad told them, already holding a coat in one hand and the boxed-up cake. With very little prompting, the others walked through the portal one by one, and unfortunately different levels of dizziness, Oz and Yu getting the worst of it. Nijire, though, looked mostly all right and gasped as soon as she saw the paddock. "Sheep!" Nijire exclaimed, shooting off and jumping the fence into the sheep pen to start cuddling with one of the lambs. Miyake observed the surroundings with his head tilted, his tongue darting out. "Is this Deku-Sensei's farm?" he asked, using his tail to keep Oz upright. "Indeed. I'm guessing you heard of this place before, Miyake-kun," his dad guessed, since he had mentioned that Miyake had known Deku-Sensei the longest out of all of them. Deku-Sensei has mentioned his farm before. Miyake confirmed with a small nod. Joseph, the boss that Deku-Sensei introduced Mirio to last time they talked, came over soon enough and started up a conversation with his dad. While the rest of them began to drift to either the table that was set up for them or join Nijire on the other side of the fence and started to play with the sheep. Mirio joined in and played around with the sheep and even introduced his friends to the sheep that he had known the best over his visits. Then after a few minutes, Mirio decided that it was time for presents, and they all sat around the little picnic table that the staff must have dug out from somewhere. He smiled, opening the presents, and he felt more tickled than anything else when most of them were for self-defense. Pepper spray bottles from Yu, a few different pocket knives from Miyake. Mirio wasn't sure he wanted to know how or where exactly Nijire got a cattle prod, but the thought was sweet enough, and he would definitely try the fancy butterfly-shaped chocolates later. The gold sparkling ribbon was a nice touch to the cattle prod. Oz's present was probably the most normal gift, considering it was some custom merch, and of course he was going to wear the new jacket modeled after the Midnight Boys jackets. The temporary hero-themed tattoos his dad got him were quickly divided amongst them with plans of putting them on after they had cake. "Okay, Sonny, you ready to give me your present now?" Mirio asked, turning to Sonny, who had oddly chosen to give his gift last this time around. Normally, Sonny wanted to give his gift first to have less attention on what he'd given someone. Sonny nervously ducked his head and squirmed before he passed over the box he'd been carrying and avoiding looking him in the eye. "Don't worry so much, Sonny," Mirio told him, giving his best friend a side hug before unwrapping the present. "I'm sure that whatever you got me is going to be..." Mirio continued. Words of assurance trailed off when he saw what was inside the box. For a second, Mirio couldn't understand what he was looking at. Then tears began to build up in his eyes. "Sonny, is that?" Mirio muttered in disbelief. How else was he supposed to react, though, when he saw the comic inside? A comic that he could tell from the cover alone was about him that was no doubt a one-of-a-kind. Because the cover's image was of him way back when he and Sonny were younger, bright smile and a hand on his hips, the rising sun behind him and his other hand outstretched to the reader. Lemillion, the title read in bold letters, Issue 1, Origins, the first of many. It's strong to remember what people see in you most of the time, even if you don't have a reason to doubt them. Sonny hesitantly started to speak. "I could spend hours and hours telling you how much your help meant to me, but I could never find the words that would actually let you understand that," Sonny sadly said as he fidgeted with his fingers. "So, I asked Deku-Sensei, help me make this for you," Sonny explained, gently removing the comic from the box and looking upon it while rubbing his thumb across the cover. "Because then I could show you just how much you helped me get to where I am now." Sonny paused to swallow. "And so, if you start to doubt yourself again, you have something you can hold in your hands to remind yourself that whatever is making you think that is wrong and that you're going to be one of the best heroes out there," Sonny explained, raising his head. An awkward, lopsided smile was on Sonny's face before he told Mirio something that made him start crying in earnest. That you're a hero that will always offer his hand to whoever needs it and help them reach for their dreams, just like you have done for me ever since we met. Mirio didn't hesitate to throw himself forward and all but crush Sonny in a hug. Deku-Sensei's words came to his mind as his heart felt like it was going to burst right out of his CHSD from how big it was swelling up in his CHSD. Because Deku-Sensei was right. He didn't need inheritance or anything else to be the hero he dreamed of since he was young. He was already enough just as he was, and he had already saved people just by offering his hand. That he had been Sonny's hero for years. And maybe that would take time for those thoughts to fully cement themselves within his mind, but he had friends and family that would always be there to pick him back up when he stumbled. On the news later that day, reporter. And in other news, police are stumped over sudden and seemingly random vandalism of one of the large apartment complexes. Reporter 2. Indeed they are. Today marks the third day that the local complex has been covered in glitter toilet paper, though plans to have been made to watch over the building in an effort to deter further vandalism or catch the vandals. Mirio. That's weird. Oz, tired and covering Nijire's mouth so she doesn't out them. Yes, so weird, SDRPR. Yu. hiding her phone after checking with Aizawa if they were still on for round 4. The weirdest. Mizo wished he could say that he had been blindsided by the reveal that Bakugo had once hurt Mido-kun, that he felt the same shock that Awa-kun and Yukai felt when Bakugo had brought them out to the woods and confessed everything to them. And while he was surprised by the actual depth of the pain and torment that Bakugo inflicted upon Mido-kun, Mizo wasn't at all shocked that Bakugo bullied him. There had been some nagging doubt in the back of his mind since he first met Bakugo about how close he and Mido-kun actually were. Why hadn't they met Bakugo earlier with how much Mido-kun talked about him before now? Mido-kun came up with a lot of excuses for why before, excuses that he could see through now that he knew the full context. Bakugo was apparently in therapy and refusing to see Mido-kun because it wasn't healthy for them. Mido-kun had just thought they were taking a break from each other after having been bound by the hip for years until he got a letter from Bakugo about their friendship. A letter that had apparently forced Mido-kun to reevaluate his friendship with Bakugo without the rose-tinted view coloring it as much. Mido-kun had to admit to himself that he had taken to lying to everyone, including himself, about how his relationship with Bakugo actually was. But Mizo had suspected as much long before he met Bakugo in person that there was a reason they didn't talk, some kind of falling out of sorts when they were young, considering most of the stories that Mido-kun told them was from when they were 5. He'd seen people drift apart once quirks came in, even if he didn't have friends before Mido-kun. Mizo wasn't blind either, and had seen the other kids he went to school with build and break friendships based upon their quirks. It was stupid, but it happened. Villainous, quirked kids stuck together, and mutant quirk kids had all sorts of cliques revolving around what their quirks made them look like. Part of Mizo wanted to lie to himself, and to think the reason that Bakugo was so abrasive and crude was because of having to deal with the bigotry surrounding Mido-kun since they were kids. Having developed it to keep everyone away from him and Mido-kun and just naturally defensive after all of these years. However, Mizo was also ready for the less romantic and reality-based idea that Bakugo and Mido-kun drifted ungracefully away from each other once Mido-kun was announced to be a two-toes. Kids were dumb like that, especially hot-headed ones that thought they had been betrayed, even if it was something completely out of anyone's hands. Maybe some fighting between them over Mido-kun's admittedly dangerous choice of job and charity in the red light districts all over Japan if they had tentatively reconnected later when they were older and more mature than toddlers. But not in his wildest of thoughts did Mizo think that Bakugo had hurt Mido-kun enough to put him in the hospital. He'd been angry at first, much like Yukai had been, but after the initial rage simmered away, a very deep-seated concern had replaced it. Mido-kun had always brushed off a lot of the mistreatment he used to get with a shrug of, "What can you do?" after his fear of interaction with people outside the districts faded away. And Mido-kun's surprising pain tolerance had come to his mind. So, once he'd had a night to sleep on it, he asked Mido-kun more about Bakugo, trying in some vain attempt to better understand why Mido-kun still hung out with someone that he told them he'd steer his students away from in any other circumstance. Mido-kun's answers were enlightening as they were concerning. Sometimes his answers were both, but not always. My classmates used to leave red spider lilies on my desk when they knew Bakugo wasn't going to be early like usual, Mido-kun told him one night, and Mizo's heart almost fell out of his chest like a stone. I didn't mind that, they're actually my favorite flower because I can relate to them in a way. But I had to hide them in my backpack before Katsuki got there, or he would have lost his mind and beat everyone in our class to hell and back. Mido-kun continued to explain when he hadn't been able to choke out anything in response. There have been a lot of comments like that in their late-night talks that made his concerns feel more real, but just as quickly as a troubling behavior was mentioned, Mido-kun followed up with something related to it that usually connected back to Bakugo in some way. Even if Mizo didn't like the way Bakugo had reacted and treated Mido-kun back then, he begrudgingly could see how Mido-kun could twist and turn Bakugo's actions in a more thoughtful light. Bakugo was like barbed wire back then, Mido-kun compared at some point during their conversations. If I got too close or pushed him the wrong way, he'd hurt me, but for as much as he hurt me, he ultimately kept me safe from people that were much worse. Mizo couldn't help asking who could have hurt worse than Bakugo had, and Mido-kun chuckled in a mirthless way some of the more jaded people in the apartments had. Emotionally, I don't know anyone but my mom who could have. Physically. Not by a long shot. You didn't think Katsuki was the only person that hurt me, did you? Mido-kun replied, in a voice that would have been lightheartedly teasing if Mizo didn't know that Mido-kun was probably being 100% serious as he said that. When Mizo remained quiet, Mido-kun started to ramble on, briefly naming some of the people that had struck out in his mind. Most of Mido-kun and Bakuga's classmates apparently knew better than to mess with Mido-kun physically unless they wanted Bakuga to swiftly turn on them for getting in the way. Outside of their classmates, though, Mido-kun was basically free game to anyone that could recognize him as a two-toes because of his shoes. A drunk that tossed a half-empty bottle that left his back with cuts and broken glass in them had been recounted with the same levity that Awa-kun had when he told them about the little cut on his knee from trying to impress a girl with his non-existent skating skills before they met the boy. As was the girl with a strength quirk that would literally grab him by the hair and toss him around, a girl that did so without any care that if Mido-kun didn't know how to tuck himself in right could have broken something if he landed wrong. The said girl left the prefecture because Bakuga caught her doing that once and all, but mauled her for it without using his quirk except to singe her hair. Mido-kun did confess that Bakuga would have done more to that girl, but Mido-kun had recovered enough to stop the fight from getting any worse than that. Mizo hated hearing each story for so many reasons. The stories hadn't painted Bakuga to be a saint by any measure. He still sounded like he'd been awful to Mido-kun most of the time. But Bakuga was also the lesser of two evils at times when compared to the few stories of other people hurting Mido-kun. Unless Bakuga was in the middle of a fit or blackout, then the burns never went beyond first-degree burns that could be treated with off-the-rack burn. Cream. Punches hurt, but Bakuga was careful not to hit anywhere he knew Mido-kun had been hurt bad recently. The same care was not shown to him from other people, such as intentionally spilling lemonade or other acidic drinks on him when they knew that he had cuts from one of the students that kissed up to Bakuga. Mido-kun bemoaned how he'd have to clean out those cuts in the bathrooms and hope he didn't get an infection from them doing that, while Mizo listened on in silent horror on the other end of the phone. Because the more and more he learned of Mido-kun's mistreatment before his mother found out, the more he wondered how Mido-kun managed to be anything less than paranoid of the people around him. If Mizo had been in Mido-kun's shoes, then he would have run away years ago just to escape from everyone in his life and live under a rock or something to avoid people. When he asked how his mom hadn't found out about the bullying, Mido-kun bashfully answered, "Mom used to work at a hospital kids terminal ward and her quirk was great for helping with kids that couldn't have people in their rooms. So she worked a lot of back-to-back shifts so we would have to worry about money." Mido-kun explained. So, most days she would be gone before I left for school, and I'd walk with Bakuga. After school, I'd have hours to hide or dispose of the evidence before she got home. With how tired she was, it was easy to hide it most of the time, and I had her old medical books to learn how to patch myself back up with stuff I got with my pocket money. Mido-kun further elaborated. I didn't feel good about it. I still don't, but I just couldn't let her know. Mido-kun confessed shamefully. Mizo wished he didn't understand Mido-kun from that one justification alone. But he did. He had been bullied a lot for various reasons, and he never told his mom about it either. When she was working nights at seedy places before they moved, it was easy to hide the bullying from his tired mom coming off of her night shift. It was because of all of those resulting talks that Mizo told Mido-kun he wouldn't mind if Bakuga had come to his birthday party, and that he'd be coming regardless. Yukai had also come to celebrate despite Bakuga's presence. She had mainly ignored Bakuga for the couple of hours they had been there, and focused on wishing Mido-kun a happy birthday. And it was a great party so far. Any awkwardness was easily overlooked, as everyone had just seemed to be having fun talking about what they had gotten up to during their break, or getting wrapped up in a new board game that Awa-kun bought for Mido-kun that was full of hero trivia. As everyone was distracted with the game, however, Mizo took the opportunity to sneak outside, dragging a surprisingly cooperative Bakuga along with him. The sun had set an hour ago, so the two of them stood out in the relative darkness, only able to see each other in the pleasantly cool night because of the not-too-distant streetlights. "You got something to say to me, or not?" Bakuga questioned after a minute, his arms crossed as he turned to Mizo, the bandage on his nose making his voice sound just a touch off-key. Mizo took a moment to just stare at Bakuga, then took a deep breath, and he began to say his piece. "I don't forgive you for what you did to Mido-kun," Mizo told him, pausing to see what kind of response Bakuga would have. Good, was all the blonde said unwaveringly. I won't stop Mirio-kun from hanging out with you, or meeting with you myself. But don't think that means I will forget what you've done to him either. Mizo flatly said next. Bakugo gave a tiny respectful nod to him. I wouldn't expect anything less, he told Mizo, relieved of all things. Mizo paused to consider Bakugo again, whether he wanted to go through with the last part he thought of when he planned this confrontation with Bakugo. Because for all intents and purposes, it looked like Mirio-kun was being honest about Bakugo wanting to change and have people there to hold him accountable. As Bakugo moved to go back inside, though his mind was made up, and Mizo grabbed Bakugo by the neck and slammed Bakugo's back to the wall of the apartment building. Bakugo hissed, and his hands went to Mizo's hand holding his neck and looking at him wearily. But Bakugo made no move to call for help or even pry Mizo's hand off of his neck. Mizo brought his free hand up to pull down his mask, and he revealed his bulky and uneven fangs as he leaned in to be almost nose to Bakugo's face. If you ever hurt Mirio-kun like that again, I will make sure there won't be enough left of you to bury or burn. Mizo snarled, using his own voice. It was wispy, and his words cracked from his lack of using it. Am I clear? Mizo questioned, glaring down at Bakugo. Bakugo stared at him, then said, Crystal Eldritch F, Good? Mizo rasped, then let go of Bakugo, and he pulled his mask back up. He waited for Bakugo to get back to his feet, the boy rubbing his sore neck before following him inside. Hey, are you guys okay? We heard a thump, and we were just about to come check on you. Mirio-kun asked, concerned as he stood in the doorway. Mizo paused, not wanting to lie to Mirio-kun, but not wanting to ruin Mirio-kun's birthday either by telling him the truth that he had threatened Bakugo. Bakugo, though, scared, and then signed to Mirio-kun. That dumb alley cat the upstairs neighbors got ran past us while we were taking a breather, and I had to avoid the F-demon. Mirio-kun relaxed and began to look over Bakugo's back until Bakugo flipped him and stalked back into the main area. Mizo watched the two of them, momentarily forgotten, as Bakugo and Mirio-kun bickered playfully. He wasn't sure that he could be friends with Bakugo again. But part of him wasn't as opposed to the idea as he previously was, if only because Bakugo was so willing to take the responsibility for what he had done. Izuku causally trauma-dumping on his friend Mizo, having an existential crisis in his bed over said trauma, dumping Katsuki with his broken nose, and had to live through a lot of said trauma with Izuku / caused it. First time. Nijire smiled as she woke up in her and Jiki's sea and shook her body. Having become used to the changes to her body in this space, moving the tentacles in her tail like it was natural, and the armor plates felt just as right as the hair on her head. Though she was excited to see her body glowing with spiral patterns all over her, and leapt through the water looking for Jiki to show him the newest addition to her body here. Leaving the kelp forest and shooting up for the coral reef, crossing the distance with ease now when it would have taken her hours a week ago. Jiki must have had the same idea, since he was waiting for her right on the edge, his own glowing patterns not as prominent in the brighter part of the sea. His violet glow reminded her of animals' patterns, stripes and spots all over his arms, legs and back, panda markings on his face, and she had to coo at them, only to be shocked when her own voice came out. "We can talk," Nijire exclaimed, her voice completely unchanged by the water around them or her sharp shark teeth in her mouth. "We can?" Jiki said, surprised himself. "Do you think this means we can go meet the others in the main space now?" Nijire asked excitedly. Jiki just shrugged with a soft grin, and she squealed. Nijire was very happy that she could still make the dolphin version of the noise and race back for the edge of the reef and down into the depths. They had explored the sea of their space and found many environments that Jiki and she had come to love visiting, with the various animals to play around with them, though there were areas they had claimed for themselves. The kelp forest belonged to her, and the reef was Jiki's. And with the help of Anne and Nana, they had figured out where the exit of their space was, because whatever was above the waves wasn't the main space contrary to their belief, but a very big brine pool deep down. Mirio, though, had pointed out it made a bit of sense, and sort of an inside joke. Their space was a sea because of their quirks, and the rest of the space was in a sea within a sea. A reverse of how their quirks was now in a collective of quirks. Nijire knew she hadn't left Jiki behind, and was happy to see that his pattern was glowing much brighter now, passing the fish around them as they made their way to the large dark pool of water that had a visible difference in the water texture. Wow, we can actually get right up and close with it now, Nijire commented as she let her feet rest on the bed of mussels that had created a shoreline of the brine pool. Jiki touched down, right next to her, and very carefully leaned over and tapped the surface with one of his tentacles. We can touch it too, Jiki commented, kneeling down to get a better look at the water's surface. Nijire hummed and rubbed her chin with one of her tentacles, considering whether or not they should try to go through the pool and into the main space, or hold off for tomorrow night when inheritance might be more settled. A white glowing hand coming out of the pool only a foot away from them made her and Jiki leap back shocked, and were even more surprised when the rest of the glowing human's head came through and they saw they only had one eye, in addition to the fact that the guy's whole body was glowing in white. I'm sorry for scaring you, the man apologized. You're human-looking. Why are you human-looking? Nijire questioned, confused, while Jiki hid somewhat behind her. The man blinked and then looked at himself, confused. Maybe because I'm the first, the man answered, looking equally confused at his own appearance. Oh, that means you're Yuchi, right? Nijire guessed, remembering some of what Nana and Deku-Sensei told her about the past users. The glowing man nodded. Sorry we haven't talked before now. While there wasn't any resistance to entering your space, we didn't want to overload either of you by all of us visiting you all at once. Yuchi answered her. Then why you coming now? Nijire asked, coming back down to stand on the mussel beach, Jiki coming out from behind her, but staying pressed against her side. Well, your space looks like a sea below the main space's floating mass, but it's been getting closer and closer, and now it's only just 6 inches from overtaking the land. Yuchi explained. So, we wanted to see how you both were doing, Yuchi told them, resting his arms on the mussel shore. Oh, we can touch the brine pool now, but I'm not sure if we can go through just yet. I was considering if we should wait another day, Nijire informed him. Yuchi hummed back. If you can touch it, then you should be able to come through now. You wouldn't be able to touch the exit of your space otherwise, Yuchi said, one of his hands coming up to his chin. The transition between the two will feel weird since it's a perspective shift between the two spaces, and you might want to hold off if you don't think you'll be ready to feel the our really collective unconscious, Yuchi suggested. Write the collective unconscious. Nijire thought, crossing her arms as she looked upwards. She might be ready for that, but Jiki might not be. Yagi-san had warned them that it was very intense when he first felt it, and that the memories of the other users would certainly enter their minds when they left their space. What do you think, Jiki? Do you want to go for it? Nijire asked, turning to her friend. Jiki bit his lip, then chirped positively, nodding his head. Okay, into the breach then, Nijire said confidently as she tightly held Jiki's hand, her other hand in the air along with her tentacles. Then, before they could overthink anything, she dragged Jiki up and shot for the brine pool with her eyes closed and braced for the impact. However, as braced as she was, nothing could have prepared her for the solid otherness that hit and filled her to the point she had to gasp. She couldn't help smiling as her cousins giggled and placed flowers in her hair while she was laying in the field of flowers behind their shrine. Then she was being held in her mom's only arm, and despite the fever making her feel icky, she couldn't help smiling and trying to hum with her mom as she swayed with her. Next, she was in a field stargazing for the first time with her boyfriend on their first date, and feeling nervous when he held her hand as he pointed out the constellations. She blinked, then she was walking through a hallway. She filled it with smoke and looking all around for the classmate she was fighting for her final exams. And then after she placed down the girl she just saved, she had to use Black Whip again to grab another falling civilian before they hit the ocean below. Her body, muscles, and even her bones felt like they were aching as she slid down the tree she had been punching, her knuckles bleeding, but she couldn't let herself stay down for long since she needed to continue training. Nijire spat in the man holding her arms down and kicked her leg with the full force she had been building up to breaking the support beam of the building they had kept her in, grinning as she brought it all down on them, even with her leg now broke. She gritted her teeth as she stood outside the ruins of the building in front of her, her partner's hand on her shoulder as the rain poured around them. hoping that maybe the saying her grandma about the rain welcoming the dead to paradise was true, because the brat deserved that much. Tears couldn't stop falling from her eyes as she stood watching her daddy being lowered to the ground while holding her big brother's hand. Jiki's hand squeezing her own brought her out of the memories, finding herself sat on her knees and gasping for breath. "Jiki," she called, turning and seeing a similarly shaken Jiki on his knees with tears pouring down his face. Jiki whimpered back, and Nijire was quick to pull him over and let him bury his head in her shoulder. She swallowed and rubbed his back, trying to comfort him. Hey, you're both going to be okay, guys," Nana said, quickly coming over and hugging them too. "Just breath, it'll pass," Nana assured them, letting them both lean on her to ground themselves. Jiki asked, coming back to himself somewhat. "Yeah, it's me, honey. I'm here, Jiki-kun," Nana assured him, squeezing his shoulder before turning to her. "Are you okay, Nijire-chan?" Nana asked, her hand in Nijire's hair. Nijire nodded, taking in Nana's human appearance for the first time, before looking around at their surroundings next. They were on some kind of rock, and their sea surrounded it. And despite the fact that she saw everything around them like it was a clear sunny day, the sky above was only a void with less than a dozen stars above them. Looking behind and over Nana's shoulder, Nijire saw a bunch of thrones and the other past users, no doubt, and a young Yagi-san. The young-looking Yagi-san also rushed over to them and offered her a hand up. "Hato-chan, are you okay?" Yagi-san asked her. "Yagi-san, you're younger," she questioned. She didn't think that it could be him, cause he didn't look much older than her, but who else could be? Yagi-san flushed and rubbed the back of his neck nervously. "That's because all of us will appear as we looked when we first given inheritance, Hato, or passed on in my case." Yuchi answered for Yagi-san, and Nijire guessed once she saw him. "You look like Deku-Sensei," Nijire exclaimed, pointing at him. "Are you related to him?" Nijire questioned before turning to Yagi-san and further asking, "Did you know that Yuchi-san and Deku-Sensei were related?" Yuchi turned red, and at the same time, he and Yagi-san said no. The rest of the users shouted back, yes, including Nana, making Yagi-san even more flustered and start sputtering like Jiki would. "We've all collectively agreed that Yuchi is Midoriya's father. Yuchi has also called Midoriya his son. One of the others." And she remembered from the files now that her head didn't feel like it was being crushed, said as he stepped forward to stand behind Nana. "It was a slip of the tongue," Yuchi protested bashfully. Nana shook her head, then helped Jiki stand up and kept him steady. "Don't listen to my nephew, he's still coming to terms with being a father," Nana told them. "Nana, I'm not your nephew. I was born and died centuries before you existed," Yuchi fruitless protested. "That didn't stop you from knocking up some eldritch creature and having Junior brat." The man with his hair up in a ponytail shouted back. Yuchi groaned into his hands, having given up on the argument, and swiftly tried to change the conversation. "Whatever, let's just get you and Amajiki properly introduced to the past holders before you both wake up," Yuchi said, motioning for them to join him as they walked over to the thrones in the main part of the space. Nana guiding them to their throne as everyone else sat down. It had to be her and Jiki's since it was the only one that was doubled, allowing for 2 people to sit on it. She happily sat on her side and offered her hand to Jiki once he was settled on his half of the throne. Nijire looked around the group of people and guessed they had to be sitting in numerical order, since Yuchi was on one side of them and Yagi-san on their right, Nana on his right, followed by In, and so on. You've already become acquainted with Nana and Yagi, the 7th and 8th wielders, respectively. Yuchi began motioning over to the 2 of them in their own thrones. "And you dash," Yuchi was cut off from continuing by Nana speaking up. "Your grandma and father." "You mean Yuchi," Nana corrected, and Yuchi buried his head in his hands. "Nana," Yagi-san hissed, flustered, while Jiki stared at her gobsmacked. "Father," Jiki sputtered. Nana nodded confidently. "Of course, I gave Toshi inheritance, and he gave both of you inheritance, and it's passed by DNA, so that makes Toshi my son, and you both my grandbabies," Nana explained for them. "That is not how it works, and you know it, Nana," Yuchi exclaimed, exasperated with her. Meanwhile, Nijire contemplated this new addition to the family tree and gasped. "Does that mean that Deku-Sensei's our cousin now?" she questioned, excited as she looked over to Nana. Nana smiled sweetly as she nodded her head while the others all stared at the two of them. "Oh no, not another one," Yuchi muttered, looking utterly defeated as he slumped on his throne. "Wait, Jiki, that means you're my brother now. I've always wanted to have a baby brother," Nijire exclaimed, reaching across the arm of their throne and hugged him. Jiki squeaking, but not fighting her hug. "Wasn't Amichikoin born in March?" Yagi-san pointed out. "Eighth, I think we've already established just how little CRP like that actually matters to them in these cases," the man on the other side of Yuchi said with a snort. "How else do you think you ended up with the Yuchi becoming your cousin?" The guy in the green cape commented with his arms crossed. The air in this prefecture was thicker, the scent of pollution almost suffocating. Iron tangs to the air and plumes of smoke, a show of the corruption that openly stalked the streets. However, for all their boldness, they prided themselves around their boastfulness, allowed Stain to continue on with his mission without his victims' notice. Using the shadows they cast to move unseen, taking advantage of the blind spots that had been intentionally left for something far greater than his victims could have ever dreamed of. To turn predators into prey. Prey that was completely oblivious to where he sat above them, watching them and all of their sins. His victims naively convinced that they were able to perfectly mask their true selves from the rest of the world as they continued to take advantage of those they viewed as beneath them. The whole lot of them so used to taking without any question that many of them didn't even bother to hide their shameless behavior from the world as they knew it. Such as Endeavor. The man was at the very top of his list to purge from this tainted world. Unfortunately, he didn't have the ability to cleanse that man yet. Too much to risk for so early on in his mission, to cleanse the streets of those who hid their evils behind the word hero. Stain's hand gripped his blade tighter as he thought of their blasphemy upon the once respectable name of such a righteous idea, twisted and warped by those that held no honor or self-respect for the legacies they were making. A large TV projecting the nightly news caused him to pause as the civilians on it discussed the recently held billboard results once again. The discussion was a reminder of why he stood on a rooftop instead of stalking his next victim. Thunderous booms and rain pelting the world suitably thematic as he pondered the end of an era. Because, for all the millions of monsters and fakes that hid behind and abused the very meaning of the word, there were a handful of people out there that truly lived up to the ideals of what it meant to be a hero. All Might, even with the fame and power to crush the world in his hands, simply reached out to those that the world had thrown away and used the gifts given to him to bring about as much peace for them as he could. He could remember when he first met the man. Perhaps it was just one of many fires for the hero, but that building held his grandparents, the kind and God-fearing people that refused to allow his parents to simply abandon him when his quirk had come in and raised him themselves even though his parents called him sick. Both of whom would have been left to burn if All Might had not come to pull them out. He remembered the fiery resolve that was lit in his CHSD that day, when the calling to become a hero ensnared him when his name was still Akaguro Kaizome, a naive boy wanting to follow in All Might's footsteps. His dreams of becoming a brilliant and bold hero that reached his hand out to all were swiftly crushed, though. The well of heroes, tainted by snakes that only allowed the most vicious of the greedy to profit from the corruption they sowed, letting only their own ilk take their share of fame, and the powerful to crush the meek beneath their feet. His disgust drove him to plead with the people of the BLD that covered their supposed heroes' hands. But as with many times in history, the people would not listen to words alone, and the righteous fire that All Might sparked within him burned to the point he chose to act. To show the many, ignorant to the sins of the heroes by exposing the rot they let happen, if not actively aided in to line their pockets. But even that was not enough in the end. So, once he was left alone in the world after burying the loving grandparents that had given him everything they could in the last years of their lives, he too laid to rest Akaguro Kaizome and his chosen name of Stendhal. Neither of those names would be needed for his new mission, one that would be violent, bloody, and raw, full of pain and suffering for everyone involved, himself included. Murder could be justified, but even if every body he put in the ground deserved to have their festering corpses rot and be consumed by their sins, he was still paving himself a road to hell for it. And even though it meant he'd never be reunited with his grandparents in paradise, He knew that his mission was right, and that he needed to cleanse the world of those that used their power or fame to harm the people they were meant to protect. His hands would forever be stained red with the BLD of those he'd demon. But he would shoulder the burden of being the one to carry the greatest of sins to ensure that the world would be changed for the better. Even if it meant that he must stain the streets with the BLD of those that pretended to be heroes. All Might's retirement would only make his mission all the more important. He knew that the fakes would pounce on the chaos to further spread their twisted rule over the world. None of that was All Might's fault, though. All Might had been a brave and defiant light of hope and peace even when the world around him was tainted by so much corruption. But he was no god, merely a brave man upholding justice in a world of vile monsters that pretended to be his peers. A man that made the bravest choice once again by choosing to step down and away before his body truly began to give out on him. To show all of those naive and still hopeful of becoming true heroes that there was no shame in stepping away for your health, that pushing yourself to your death or to irreparably damage themselves was not the only choices that you had as a hero. A duty to uphold justice and obligation to do what was right, yes, but that one must also acknowledge when their time had come and to make the right choice of stepping aside when forcing themselves to continue would only endanger those they swore to protect. However, All Might wasn't just wiping away the martyrdom the Commission all but demanded, but continuing to show his conviction in the power of the civilians around them and their own power to bring change. All but promising to not give up his fight on the corruption in the world by using his voice to speak on the behalf of the many who could not. I am here. Words that All Might had held on to so fervently in memory of his dear mother, and yet he so freely gave to the world. Something so precious was given without a second thought to all who needed it. Just as any true hero would. He allowed his head to fall backwards, and he took a deep breath of the chill air, his breath coming out in a small puff of mist as he let himself mourn. All Might was not dead. He was sure that even once the day came for the man behind the grand figure of the symbol of peace was to be buried, that the legacy of All Might would not fade. But the billboard was still the beginning of an era. One day, All Might would fully step away from the field, and his speech at the hero's billboard was only the first of many steps of such a journey. And just for one day, he'd give himself the night to feel the impact of such a loss, something he would not be able to do later once All Might was no longer there to hold the rest of his peers accountable. However, as he looked back to the large public screen, he had to think that perhaps All Might was right, that not all hope was lost with his eventual departure from heroics. The screen changed, now showing the green net that worked at UA. This Mirio Izuku did not share All Might's optimism, but he did ignite some hope within himself for the future generations. He did not know the boy well, but he'd seen parts of himself reflected in the quirkless boy. Someone that was willing to not just step in when the supposed heroes were abusing their power, but to stop them from harming others, whether they were pro-heroes terrorizing children or greedy brats attempting to take advantage of the corrupt system. He relished seeing the same fire within himself reflected in the boy's eyes as he confronted the public with its own hypocrisy. But Mirio was doing something he could have only wished would happen back when he was pleading to the people on the streets before taking up the new name of Stain for his crusade to cleanse their tainted world. He was making the world pay attention to the heroes. Sure, some of the news was purely obsessed with the boy's quirk status, but the rest. Heroes were being questioned on their opinions regarding Midoriya's actions and being forced to reveal their true stance on issues that were never brought up before. Already Midoriya's words had brought a crippling wound to one of the worst fakes of all of Japan's heroes. Why else would Endeavor be dragged down to 5th place? The furthest he's fallen in the rankings in 2 decades. And if that wasn't enough, he was bringing change to the hero industry through the students that were under his guidance, from the young girl Haku's refusal to play into the hands of those that abused their title at the sports festival, to the protection of the students with pure intentions being targeted while still young. It was clear that Midoriya was helping to aid a new golden age of pure heroes by instilling the ideals of true heroism among the students of UA, the very school that All Might himself once learned. So, Stain had hope for this new era of heroes, with Midoriya's firm but nurturing cultivation of new heroes and his culling of the monsters hiding behind the masks of the mighty. The dawn was looking far brighter than he expected it to. Stain moved over to the side of the roof where the fire escape was and leaped over the side, with plans to turn in for the night and wake tomorrow morning early and prepare to begin his hunt anew. Shigaraki smirked as he heard the doctor fuss in front of him. The man had been so wrapped up in his latest project that he hadn't heard the news of the hero billboard before now. He'd of course been watching in real time, since he always found the event mildly amusing considering all of the lists that the commission had made over the years. Even so, he let the doctor lose himself in his worry for a few minutes. He could not see the doctor, but the man was making enough noise that it wasn't strong to picture the man's flailing. However, after a minute had passed, Shigaraki found the man's cries had become grating, and he let his head fall into his palm. "I'm well aware of that foolish oaf speech at the hero rankings, doctor," he said, fully cutting off the man's hysterics. "And naturally, I would never doubt you wouldn't," the doctor immediately stammered back, "but this wasn't accounted for. Our plans never considered the idea of the boy retiring from heroics." The doctor countered, no doubt waving his arms. Shigaraki's lip twitched down at the reminder. He loathed to admit it, but the doctor was correct that none of their plans had considered that his brother's current pet would willingly step away from the field. Sure, there were plans to force the stubborn brat by mutilating him into a state similar to his current body's health, but not for the idiot to voluntarily walk away without a little mental manipulation. In fact, his brother's current pet announcing his plans for part-time work had come as a great surprise to him at first. However, the brat's hollow brain wasn't strong to pick apart, and upon realizing the only reason why his brother's pet would do so, well, it only played into his plan. Maybe skipped a step or two, but they were ultimately on schedule, all things considered. "Tell me, doctor, why do you think my brother's current host would choose to do something so rash?" Shigaraki inquired, with his free hand held out in a way that invited the other to speak. The doctor paused to consider the idea, muttering under his breath with only a few syllables being caught by Shigaraki. "Why isn't obvious, doctor?" Shigaraki continued, tired of waiting for the man to reach the conclusion on his own. "The fool is finally ready to find himself a successor to pass my brother on, and without my brother's quirk he'll soon be nothing but a husk." Shigaraki told him with a chuckle. "Ah, of course, MSTR. A shame little James wasn't needed, but this is fantastic news." The doctor commented, sharing in his delight now that he was on the same page with him. "Yes, what a shame," Shigaraki agreed placatingly, rolling his eyes internally. However, considering the bumbling buffoon would not make such announcement without already having a plan for finding one, or already a person in mind, I've already had my people looking into things. Shigaraki explained to him. Part of him wished he could wave around a stack of papers like he used to, but such files and dramatics would have to wait until he had eyes once again. And while we haven't been able to follow his movements in person, Shigaraki said leadingly with no small amount of annoyance, the hero working with that pathetic woman had taught his brother's pet better than he previously thought. We have confirmed that he seems to have plans to join you. A's staff as a teacher if his application to study for a teaching degree and texts with Nizu are anything to go by. Shigaraki stated with a smirk when the doctor started chuckling. My, how the stars align themselves, the doctor said, equally amused. Indeed, we will need to inform our little scout, though, that his role will be changed somewhat. He shall also need to keep an eye out for the supposed successor of my brother's pet in addition to finding the weak spots in you. A's security. Shigaraki mused, tapping his cheek with his pointer finger of the hand his head was in. The doctor hummed, likely nodding his head. Yes. It seems that the deal we made with the Aoyamas will be more fruitful than we previously thought, MSTR. Especially if we can get the boy to befriend your brother's next host. The doctor told him, his mind already at work adjusting to the changes in the plan. Asterisk that it would. Asterisk Shigaraki agreed in his mind with a grin. Those desperate French fools offered everything including their lives if they would just give their son a quirk, any quirk. And who better than their son to be his plan in you, feeding him information about the teachers and class schedules so that he could bring down the famous institution in return for not killing the boy's foolish parents, which would bring him so much closer to ruining everything the wretch that held his brother for so long worked so strong for. World domination wasn't quite at the top of his list, on it sure, but it would be so much more satisfying since his brother's pet had to go parading himself around the world. And if nothing else, should he get bored of ruling the world, then he'd just use those leftover warheads to start all over again. Being a god to whatever civilization that rises from the nuclear ashes could be fun for a few centuries. Tamaki had expected the last of their quirks, Yuchi's quirk, to be accessible tonight, which he and Nijire had been confused by at first since didn't them having Black Whip and the others show that they had Yuchi's quirk. Apparently, according to Deku-Sensei, not quite. They were able to access most of the horde, yes, but that did not mean Yuchi's quirk was fully settled inside them, and that the quirk fully settling would mean that they would be able to pass on inheritance. So, Tamaki was expecting the glowing on his and Nijire's person. Being able to enter the main space and meeting the rest of the pass holders was not what he planned or prepared himself for, but he had Nijire with him and knew Nana-san, Yagi-san, and Insan fairly well, so he had been willing to try going to the main space. And he'd been hit by the very disordering wave of emotions and memories that were not his own, then been dragged to his and Nijire's throne to meet the other holders properly. Something that was already making his skin crawl somewhat as he looked around at the many human faces looking back at him. He'd been very glad that Nijire was with him and was more than willing to hold his hand to calm his nerves. That all being said, Tamaki was not expecting for Nana-san to declare himself and Nijire as her grandchildren. Though he wasn't able to fully process the sudden adoption via inheritance, as Nijire had immediately jumped onto the train of thought and was hugging him tightly and calling him her baby brother. He was very flustered by the whole thing, and he struggled to arrange his thoughts about it. Because he already had a dad, Tamaki hadn't met his papa before he passed, but his mama had told him plenty of stories about him, so that he'd know his papa. He didn't need another dad. Not that there was anything wrong with Yagi-san. Tamaki was sure that Yagi-san would probably be a nice dad for someone, but he didn't want Yagi-san to try and be his dad. His papa's urn and his spot in the shrine his mama had set up immediately came to mind. The pale blue urn decorated with hand-painted lily pads and koi fish. His small purple handprint clumsily added after his mama gave him permission to add some paint to it too. The memory coming to him much like the random ones that forced themselves in his head when they left his and Nijire's ocean. He sat with his mama, letting her clean the hand he dipped in the paint his mama gave him, beaming as he looked at the purple glossy paint drying on his papa's home. His mama taking his head in both of her hands and kissed his head looking at him so proudly. Feeling confused why she looked sad too. Hadn't he made papa's home prettier? Nijire's arms loosened, clearly taken aback, but then she hugged him even tighter. "Oh, Jiki," Nijire said, her voice sounding conflicted. Tamaki looked at her confused for the sudden change in her demeanor. "Amajiki, as Deku-Sensei mentioned, memory is more fluid here. And that means we can see your memories with you when you think of them." Insan informed him. Tamaki's ears folded back and he buried his face in Nijire's offered shoulder, his face burning with shame. Nijire's hand coming up to rub his back in firm circles. Tamaki jumped when he felt someone placed a hand on his other shoulder and whipped his head around to see Nana-san. "I'm sorry, Jiki-kun," Nana-san told him as she crouched down and wrapped him and Nijire into a hug. "I would never force you to replace your dad with Toshi." Nana swore if you don't want him to be your dad, then he can just be your uncle instead. Nana promised, pulling back slightly. Tamaki, still feeling his skin crawling with unease, merely looked away from her and pressed the side of his face against Nijire's shoulder. Not feeling confident to answer her like this, especially not since she had a human appearance right now. The massive seahorse with eldritch elements wasn't unalarming, especially with her large 7 black eyes staring back at them. But that was somehow still less threatening in his mind somehow, when compared to speaking with her as a human. He also did not miss the wince that crossed Nana's face before she moved away to give him more space. "You don't need to answer now, Jiki-kun. We can talk about this more another time back in your and Nijire-chan's space." "Okay," Nana-san told him. Tamaki meekly nodded, resisting the urge to bury his head again as he realized his thoughts must have spilled over, much like the memory. Nijire's arm was quick to wrap around his shoulders and stay there protectively. Her concern tinged the air, but was smothered by protectiveness, the smell of the exact emotions coming to him after a little recall from when he used animals to transform. "It's all right, Amajiki. With time, you and Nijire will be able to shield your thoughts and keep them from slipping out of your minds, the man with the green cape said. Yeah, if Yagi could figure it out, you brats will get your head screwed on the right way sooner rather than later, the bald man with goggles teasingly agreed, jabbing his thumb over towards Yagi-san. Yagi-san, for his part, choked on some kind of affronted noise that Tamaki wasn't even sure he'd be able to make out even if he had his head on straight, and wasn't emotional right now. He did feel bad for Yagi-san, though. He had been in the same position of making incomprehensible sounds before, and it was not fun on your vocal cords. Now, Banjo. Toshi isn't that bad. It just took him some time to readjust to keeping his mind separate after coming to the main space. We all did. Nana told the goggled man, waving her hand dismissively. Yeah, don't be so mean to Chi-Chi, Nijire said, pouting and crossing her arms. Unfortunately, Nijire calling him that made Yagi choke up BLD like he usually did when he was shocked. Ensign patting him on the back to help him get it all out. Wow, Chi-Chi does that here too. Nijire commented. That's because 8's been doing it for so long it's muscle memory by now. The blonde man sitting on the red throne commented, his arms crossed. Bruce is correct. If you're used to your body doing something, or think of a scar as part of yourself, then your mind will manifest them as a part of your appearance even if you didn't have it for most of your life. Yuchi confirmed with a nod. Nijire's eyes went over to Yagi-ha. But then why doesn't Chi-Chi look more like a skeleton? Nijire questioned, confused, as she pointed over to the healthier-looking man. Because he doesn't associate it with himself in a defining way, like hair dye it washes away here for the image of himself he has in mind. Insan explained. Or if the scar has a negative context in your mind, it will purposely not be manifested as a way to protect your psyche. Insan added a second later. Tamaki supposed there was some logic to that. This place was supposed to have a mental representation of themselves, and most people would subconsciously remove the parts they don't like about themselves. You can just tell them 8's being vain, you numbskulls. The angry-looking man on the BLD-stained throne waspishly commented. Now, before you idiots continue to blabber on with your Addams Family Bowl, I'm the second holder, and this F next to me is the third, Bruce, the angry man told them, introducing himself and the man next to him. Second's right. Bruce glaring at Nana when she puffed up indignantly. We don't know if we'll be able to speak with them when they're awake yet and need to introduce ourselves. Bruce scolded, causing Nana just huff back at them before sitting down in her throne. Thank you for bringing us back on track, second Bruce. Yuchi told the two, dragging his hand down his face. Then he motioned towards the man with the green cape. I'm Hikage, the fourth and the person you got danger sense from. Hikage said as prompted before jabbing his thumb at the large, goggled man in the throne next to him. This is Banjo, the fifth. Unfortunately, his only contribution is his quirk Black Whip. Hikage stated. Yeah, if you two, you string bean. Banjo grumbled, glared at his predecessor. I'm in, and I'm glad you both have been able to use my quirk smokescreen so creatively in your training. Ensan informed them, reintroduced himself, waving his hand. Tamaki really wished he could have Ensan's coat right now, so that he could bury his face in the neck like Ensan could in any moment. And that should be it for introductions. We can talk on other matters. Yuchi said, turning to them, specifically about how your training is going with the strength part of the horde. Yuchi elaborated, making Tamaki to hunch in on himself. Nijire, and he hadn't been using that part of inheritance much admittedly, both of them needing to get a hold of the more noticeable quirks like smokescreen, then practicing with the part when used wrong could harm them badly. Do not take this as criticism. We understand that you both needed to focus on the other quirks, but not using the strength part of our horde could be very damaging to both of you if we leave it unpracticed for too long, Ensan assured them. Looking down to the hand he had broken and bit his lip because Ensan was right that they couldn't just not practice, not if they wanted to avoid breaking more bones. Well, if he wanted to avoid breaking more bones. Nijire, however, basically had the management of the strength quirk, even if she hadn't used it much with trying to get the other quirks under control. Unfortunately, Yagi won't be able to help you with training your bodies himself. Yuchi informed them, Yagi shamefully ducking his head, but nodding in agreement. Why not? He's learned to use it too, right? Nijire asked, confused. Not quite, ninth. Bruce said with his arms crossed. Can't be sure of the exact reason, but Eight's body instinctively knew to spread it all out even without Eighth thinking about spreading it. Bruce explained, our leading theory so far is that Yagi's muscles are structured differently compared to our quirk muscles. Yuchi commented though. He stopped 1 second, gave him a look. Regardless, Eighth can't help you with adapting since he didn't need to. Depending on whether you both can hear us when you wake up, Fourth will either help guide you directly or indirectly through Yagi until you both can use 10% continuously. Bruce continued to inform them. Tamaki stiffly nodded, rubbing his arm to slightly distract himself. He had known that there was going to be multiple people in his head. He knew that before he took inheritance, since that was one of the questions they had asked. But he hadn't expected his quirk to cause them to be in his head so soon. Tamaki couldn't stop himself from whimpering at the thought. Nijire unconsciously took his hand, barely acknowledging the sound in the back of her mind. Tamaki could see she was wrapped in the idea, judging from her face and contemplative hum. Okay, but that brings to mind a new question I've got. Nijire told the others. Do you think that Jiki, Chi-Chi, and I will be able to mentally communicate with each other no matter where we are? Nijire inquired. Tamaki found himself taken aback by the thought. It hadn't come to mind before, but he could easily follow Nijire's logic. If they and Yagi both had access to the mind space while awake, then couldn't they speak to each other in the same way that the pass holders could speak with Yagi? It might not be perfect, like they couldn't share everything or speak directly with each other mentally, but couldn't one of the past users relay their conversation with the other two living holders? I believe that could be possible, Yuchi answered after a moment, sounding stunned by the idea himself. We would have to wait until you both can hear us while awake to test its limits, but it should be entirely doable, Yuchi said, leaning forward slightly as he began to mutter to himself. If it is, we'll need to help all three of you to develop better mental barriers. I can't speak for everyone, but I'm sure no one wants everyone else to see the Ninth's private time, especially if they find someone in the future. Banjo brought up. Tamaki's face felt like it was on fire, and he threw his arms over his face to hide away from the rest of the people in the space. Banjo! Nana scoldingly hissed. Hey, someone had to say it. We got lucky with Yagi not being into that stuff, but considering whatever is going on with that taffy kid, we're not going to avoid the awkward teen romance CRP this time. Banjo defended, and Tamaki was tempted to jump in the water to escape the rest of them. I hate that you have a point, Hikage said, sounding exasperated. Could someone please wake him up now? The last thing he wanted to think about was 8 adults in his mind seeing him do that if he settled down with someone someday. It won't just be about that, though. If their connection is on the stronger side, Yagi would have to disconnect himself to prevent them from seeing or feeling his death, especially if he dies to Aoi like most of us did, Yuchi pointed out, coming back around from his muttering. Or block his chronic pain from their fight years ago. Insan added. Tamaki's stomach twisted again at the idea as Bruce scoffed. Oh, they'd both be F if they did share that god. Could you imagine what would happen if we didn't force Eighth to start working part-time? Bruce asked. Wait, Chi-Chi's still an active hero? Nijire questioned, surprised, as was Tamaki, since he would have thought that Yagi had retired from heroics with his current state. However, before anyone could have thought to answer, Nijire gasped loudly. Chi-Chi, are you all might? Nijire shouted in disbelief. Izuku already up for the day and sitting in the private office with Rya and Mito discussing things. Izuku's phone ringing. Izuku * answers. Deku-Sensei, Sp. Nijire having just woken up. Did you know Chi-Chi was All Might? Izuku. Mito. Rya * whispers. Does she mean Yagi? Mito * whispers. Since when did Yagi adopt Hado? Izuku. After blue screening. Nijire-chan by Chi-Chi. Do you mean Yagi-san? Nijire * loud noise of frustration * Nijire. You did know. Deku-Sensei, how could you not tell your cousins about my Chi-Chi being All Might? Nijire hangs ups on Izuku, everybody. Rya, Mito, Izuku * collectively. The Inko knew from the beginning the revelation of her son and Katsuki's past would eventually come and cause problems within Izuku's new friend group. It had been a small, nagging feeling that sat in her stomach when she watched them speaking with Katsuki since Izuku's last birthday. So, the call from Mitsichin about what Katsuki was planning to do was no great shock. and it was good on him for choosing to not keep something so important hidden from the other three. It also explained Izuku's flightiness that morning. For all that she was better at paying attention to her son, she was no mind reader, so usually she was merely left to stew in her own thoughts of what could be bothering Izuku that time around. In the end, though, she was glad that Mitsuchin called her about the confrontation, since it let her prepare to help Izuku once he had returned. Shoji, Uraraka, and Owaze were all lovely kids. One she was so happy to see Izuku had been able to befriend, but they were still kids and protective ones at that. And there was some shame in her as a mother that Izuku had picked up on how she shoved her feelings to the side for others and did it himself, with even more shame being piled on after it took her so long to notice that he had. That shame rearing its head when Izuku returned home with a hauntingly familiar smile on his face. Inko hadn't let him speak before wrapping him up in a hug, allowing him to quietly fall apart over what had happened, letting him shakily explain what had happened in the woods. Watching with a heavy heart as Izuku conflictedly explained how he understood why they would react like they had, empathized even, but he couldn't stop himself from wishing that maybe they would have been more accepting, even if he knew that would never happen. Inko made sure to comfort and assure him the rest of the night to the best of her abilities. Though there wasn't much she could do when the tension between everyone was so fresh. Even when they reluctantly agreed to come to Izuku's birthday sleepover despite knowing Katsuki would be there for the party. She could see how it was affecting her son, his smile just a bit more pinched to keep it on his face whenever Uraraka pointedly ignored or avoided eye contact with Katsuki. In the worried glances he shot at Shoji when he wasn't looking after Shoji, and Katsuki stepped out for some air. And it hurt to watch and not be able to do much about it other than rub her son's back to soothe him slightly. Because she understood where Izuku's friends were coming from, and she couldn't blame them for how they were feeling, nor for the looks they gave her after finding out about Katsuki. She could practically hear the millions of questions they had for her when they looked at her. The judgment in their eyes, whether it was entirely made up in her head or actually in the three's eyes, it wasn't unwelcomed. Willingly letting her son befriend and hang out with his main bully after she hadn't pressed charges against him was not a good look. She certainly judged herself a lot for backing down so easily in the hospital. Even if it had turned out for the better, part of her would never forgive herself for it. So even though it made her skin crawl, she let Izuku's friends silently question her and her decisions. When it had come to a head in the coming days, it wasn't surprising. Owaze and Uraraka were both such outspoken people. It was only a matter of time before one of them confronted her about it all at some point. Still, the memory of Uraraka standing on her doorstep after arriving completely unannounced on a day when Izuku would not be home would probably be burned into her mind. The girl standing there slightly uneasy. The cause for the unease no mystery, but still she determinedly stood there jaw clenched and no doubt ready to question her about everything. Inko gave her a smile and invited her in since it was raining, and now the two of them were sitting on the couch, both with a mug of tea in hand. Inko waiting patiently for Uraraka to string her thoughts together to speak. You knew what he did to Izuku, Uraraka said after a minute, her eyes locked on the mug instead of looking at her. I doubt Izuku would ever tell me everything about it, but yes, I knew enough. Inko answered, not flinching when Uraraka's accusing eyes moved to her. And you weren't angry about it? Uraraka questioned, all but glaring at her, with her hands clenching the mug. No, I was very angry about it, with Katsuki and myself for not seeing it before then. Inko replied, her gaze dropping to her lap. Then why would you? Uraraka heatedly tried to say before cutting herself off with a huff, though Inko's mind was easily able to fill in the blanks. Why would you let him around Izuku again? Why would you not cut him out of your lives? Why would you not do anything about it? Why would you let Katsuki get away with it? Inko could only sigh and look up towards the ceiling in response to her unasked questions. I wanted to have Katsuki charged when Izuku first told me about what Katsuki did to him. Inko confessed, expecting the pointed look she got in return. Then why didn't you? Uraraka sharply asked back. Because in the end it would have accomplished nothing more than some hollow victory that wouldn't mean anything useful and only further hurt Izuku mentally. Inko told her dejectedly. Uraraka looked like she had been slapped and was no doubt ready to argue why that was a completely asinine, but Inko held up her hand. Uraraka, do you know what would have happened if I did try to press charges against Katsuki? Well, we could have actually gotten out of it. Inko asked the girl. You would have gotten him barred from becoming a hero once he was charged with assault. Uraraka hissed. Inko's shoulders sagged as she corrected the girl. Uraraka blinked. If we could get him charged with assault, then yes, we could have done that. Inko continued, watching as the girl looked indignant. There are goddamn videos of him using his quirk to hurt Izuku that can be found online. Uraraka protested. That must have been what broke the camel's back and drove Uraraka to finally confront her about Katsuki. Inko had heard of the videos after Katsuki's friend asked her if she knew about them, but she had chosen not to view them since she wouldn't have the stomach to. But it just wasn't that easy, and there wouldn't be one prosecutor in the country that wouldn't tell us to settle out of court if we would even be able to file a case against Katsuki in the first place. Inko told her, Uraraka's cheeks puffing up in her anger. Inko reached out and placed her hand on Uraraka's arm. Achiko, Izuku is at 2 toes. Inko gently but somberly reminded the girl, and most lawyers would turn him away for that alone, regardless of the case we'd pursue. Inko tried to explain. Uraraka's hands clench harder. So, not all of them would, and people argue for themselves all the time in court. Uraraka countered. Okay, let's say we did that, and refused the settlement Mitsichin and Mazakan would have honored, insisting on going to court and getting Katsuki a criminal record. Inko placatingly said, From how the media has been, how likely do you think it would be for us to be overseen by a judge that wouldn't throw the case out once they learned Izuku is at 2 toes? Inko asked the girl. Uraraka's lip trembled as she deflated slightly, her gaze falling to her cup of tea despite wanting to argue. And even if we did somehow end up with a judge that did hear us out and would convict Katsuki for everything that he did to Izuku, what do you really think we'd get out of it that we couldn't get from other means? Inko inquired, taking her hand back. Uraraka looked at her confused. Having a record isn't the only way to stop Katsuki from attending a hero school. If we had asked, Mitsichin and Mazakan would have sent Katsuki to a correctional school and never let him step foot in a hero school. Inko elaborated. And for money, they would never think of not covering Izuku's medical bills. It wouldn't even be a question. Lawsuit or not, they would have paid every cent and more if I let them. Inko said, remembering how Mitsichin strong-armed her into agreeing to letting them do so. But he'd still have a record. Uraraka argued, still worked up but clearly had the wind taken out of her. Yes, that's true. But do you think Izuku's mental health and future would be worth it? Inko countered. Uraraka frowned looking at her, confused no doubt, and not realizing what Inko had meant. Izuku was very emotionally fragile when I found out about the bullying, blaming himself for everything, having me go so clearly against his wishes, and in his mind cruelly punishing his only friend and the only other person in his life because of what he said could have. Inko couldn't bring herself to finish. Because for all that it would have sounded exaggerated, it was a very real fear for her at the time. She had just found out her baby had managed to hide something as big as the daily torment he went through, and maybe the words everyone said about Izuku had gotten the better of her, but the thought of Izuku doing something extreme if she pushed him too far, it wasn't a concern that she could easily dismiss. Not after learning something so shocking. Uraraka seemed to understand that, and her head hung, frustrated to the point of tears, but with little she could do about it. Inko felt her heartstrings being tugged, and she put down her mug, scooting over to be closer, and placed a hand on Uraraka's shoulder. She could not count how many times she had ended up sitting at this very table and crying into her hands, so upset with herself, and how there seemed to be nothing she could do about Izuku's situation. This is such bullshit, Uraraka miserably said under her breath as she sniffled. Inko ignored the swear, agreeing with the girl for the most part. What should I do then? Uraraka questioned, rubbing the tears pooling in her eyes away a bit rougher than she needed to. Just let it be water under the bridge, she asked incredulously. Inko shook her head. Not at all. You could be mad, Uraraka. I'm still furious over everything that happened. Inko assured Uraraka. The girl looked at her disbelievingly. Inko supposed Uraraka had a right to be dubious when Inko had happily welcomed Katsuki back into her home more than once. As strong as it might be for you to believe, I have not forgiven or forgotten what Katsuki has done to Izuku, and I never will. But for as much as I hate what he did, I can't help but blame myself for a small part of what happened. Inko confessed. Uraraka's doubt melted into pure confusion. How could you blame yourself? But Kogu was the one who hurt Izuku. You didn't force him to hurt him. Uraraka argued. Katsuki and Izuku weren't alone together in a vacuum. Hundreds of people saw what Katsuki was doing to Izuku and didn't care. I was so wrapped in my own problems that I never noticed I had become so distant from my son that he could come home covered in BLD, and I wouldn't even know. Inko morosely elaborated as her eyes fell to the floor. Their teachers, classmates, and peers saw what Katsuki was doing to Izuku every day, watched him torment Izuku, and either just let him or bullied Izuku too. Inko told the girl, her stomach twisting as she thought of just what kind of hell Izuku walked into nearly every day. And I was so out of touch with what was happening in front of me that I didn't see what was going on with my son, or I chose not to see it and pretended that I couldn't. Inko shamefully said, her hands balling themselves into fists in her lap. She had questioned herself a lot about how much she had overlooked and what she might have blatantly chosen to ignore. Surely, she should have noticed what Izuku had been going through long before the point of him coming home looking like such a mess was normal. How many times had she let Izuku lie to her about a slight limp and actually believed him? How many times had she just looked the other way because she just didn't have the mental energy to even question it? Shaking herself mentally, Inko forced herself back to the topic at hand and faced Uraraka again, the girl staring up at her with wide eyes. But even though I hate what he did, when I look at him, I can't help seeing the boy that he used to be too. Inko confessed, letting her mind wander slightly. Perhaps it was because she had helped raise the boy, but it felt impossible to truly separate Katsuki from the young boy that used to toddle around with Izuku under a blanket pretending to be a ghost. Which makes it hurt worse sometimes, especially since I had always thought of Katsuki as a son before. And I think that it's part of why I was willing to give him another chance. Inko explained, then looked back to Uraraka, and taking her hands in hers after setting down Uraraka's mug. But that doesn't mean that you have to. Inko told her, just like Izuku told you. If you don't want to see him anymore, then we'll respect that. You don't have to force yourself to be around him for any reason. Inko assured the girl. Uraraka ducked her head. I know, but Gigi and Awakuin are, and Awakuin made a lot of good points about why we should give him another chance. Uraraka replied, her shoulders slumped. Achiko, Katsuki could become a saint and live like a monk for the next 20 years. And that doesn't mean you own him even a second of your time. Everyone has their own lines, and if what Katsuki did crossed one of yours, then that is that. Inko said with a gentle smile. She had a lot of experience trying to help both Mitsichin and her son understand they could make and keep their own boundaries, and that it wasn't selfish to do so. Uraraka nodded half-heartedly, too busy with her thoughts to fully pay attention to answering. Thank you for talking with me, Inko-san, Uraraka quietly told her. Inko smiled and gently squeezed Uraraka's hands. It's not a problem. I'm always here if any of you need to talk about anything, Inko promised. Hizashi groaned as he stretched. He had just finished his last set, and thankfully his soreness from the fight yesterday was starting to fade enough for him to go out and have a good time tonight. Which was fantastic news since Tensei had chosen to come over and party with them for his birthday this year, which they hadn't done since they were 20. Not that he would blame the guy for it. Running the new branch of such a big-name agency, with nearly 50 people under him, plus the other staff, and basically raising his brother in another prefecture would leave most people too drained to keep in contact. And that was before taking into account Tensei's own hours as a pro hero on top of that. Hence why they normally went to him and crashed at his place in Tokyo. Okay, some of the clubs there were nicer too, but the three of them mainly went to see Tensei. As busy as each of them were, running businesses, working as pros, and balancing everything else they did, Hizashi knew it was important to all of them to make time for each other. As painful as it was sometimes, it was worth it. All right, I'ma clean up in the back, then I'm out of here. Catch you tomorrow, Shelly, Hizashi exclaimed over his shoulder as he left the booth. The woman scoffing, as if you'll be in any fit state to broadcast, she shouted back, making Hizashi laugh. She was probably right. Tensei's birthdays usually got wilder than their average get-togethers. Hisashi entered the back room and went straight for the shower. He was so glad he argued its necessity and enjoyed washing all of the hair products out of his hair and the grime that built up from wearing his costume. Stepping out, he made sure to wrap his hair carefully and popped out his contacts and checking his eyes once he put on his glasses. Glad to find there was no damage from wearing them for so long, Hisashi set himself to getting dressed in his nicer bar-hopping clothes and blow-drying his hair before he put it into a loose ponytail. Hisashi chuckled seeing how different he looked without all the grit and glamour of his hero persona, and for the fun of it gave himself finger guns in the mirror. Hearing his phone ping, Hisashi checked it and grinned when he saw the text from Mirio that she was waiting out front for him and shot her a thumbs up back before collecting his costume. 5 minutes later, Hisashi had slipped out of the private exit and headed towards where Mirio was parked. She whistled once she saw him as he jumped into the passenger side. "Woof, you looking to bring someone home tonight, Zashi?" Mirio teased with a chuckle as she pulled out of her parking spot. Hisashi huffed back, "Nah. Show may be in a better mood, but I'm pretty sure he'd kill me if I brought someone back to the apartment." Hisashi playfully replied. "Oh, what about your mistress?" Mirio asked, batting her eyes at him as they stopped at a stoplight. Hisashi snorted. "Then you should be ready to wake up without any hair, eyebrows included." "Show's been in a mood," Hisashi told her, and Mirio sighed. "What a pity. Guess we'll both have to abstain tonight," Mirio said, pretending to be more dejected than she actually was, making Hisashi chuckle himself at her pouty dramatics and leaning so his head was on her shoulder. "Ah, come on, Nim. We both know that you miss Tintin," Hisashi teased her. "Of course I did," Mirio snorted, pushing him away as the two of them laughed. Arriving at the bar, they planned to meet Tensei in a matter of minutes. Thankful they had chosen one of the hero hubs to get drunk at. The Ida family was pretty famous, and they didn't want to deal with a bunch of people coming up to try and chat up Tensei, and alcohol only made those fans bolder. Carefully fishing out and showing their licenses to the bouncer, they slipped inside, and were glad to see that Tensei and Shoyuta were already there. "Ten," he and Mirio exclaimed as they both glomped onto their brunette friend. Tensei, of course, laughed good-naturedly as he hugged them back. "Geez, guys, you don't have to act like I'm returning from war," Tensei teased them as they settled to sit with the two at their table. "But we haven't seen you in months," Hisashi protested, with Mirio backing him up. "Yeah, you didn't even bother to visit us the last time you were in town," she told him, poking his chest. Tensei chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. Okay, I get it," Tensei said back, holding his hands up in mock surrender. "Now come on and tell me how things have been going for you guys," Tensei asked, changing the topic. Hisashi was happy to tell Tensei all about the kids he was watching over for the year, little stories of what the students were hoping to accomplish and the projects they turned in. Mirio was just as eager to share about the debates her homeroom class got into about the current first year's costumes. "Speaking of, how is the ankle biters?" Shoyuta asked after Mirio commented about a heel sponsorship she rejected recently. "Show, come on, that was years ago. You can't hold that against Tenya forever," Hisashi playfully jibbed, softly elbowing Shuta's side where he knew Shoyuta wasn't bruised from patrol. Tensei, however, waved him and is scolding off. "Tenya's doing all right. Maybe studying too much to prep for the entrance exam next year, but I've been trying to get him to lighten up," Tensei answered, fond but exhausted with his little brother. "Is he still planning to go with the public exam?" Shoyuta inquired before sipping at his drink. "Yep," said he didn't want any special treatment. Tensei confirmed with a nod, rubbing his neck before glancing away. "I don't doubt he'll pass too. I just hope he can manage to make a couple of friends once he starts at UA," Tensei admitted, a little downtrodden. "Ah," Hisashi shared an uneasy glance with Mirio. They had met Tenya out of costume a few times and heard more from Tensei about how, what was the right word, dedicated he was to following the rules and his personality, causing a few interpersonal problems at school. So, it wasn't hard to understand how Tenya had somehow remained mostly friendless over the years. Shoyuta murped, "He'll be fine, legacy case. Plenty of people don't make friends until they're older," Shoyuta told Tensei, rather unbothered. Then he pointed with his glass in one hand at Tensei. "We didn't get closer until our second year, remember?" Shoyuta pointed out. Tensei huffed and clinked his glass with Shuta's. "Yeah, I'm probably worrying over nothing," Tensei agreed, then turned back to Namiri to ask her more about the sponsorship she turned down. Hizashi's shoulders slumped a bit, though, as his eyes went down to his own glass, nervously nibbling on his lip, as Shuta's point sat a bit heavier for him. Shoyuta hadn't been wrong. They hadn't been nearly so close to Tensei when they first met him back then. Tensei was in the same year as Namiri and in Class B at that, and with Shuta's rivalry with Tensei was more like Namiri's rich acquaintance than their friend. But then they had their work studies. Hizashi's hands tightened. They had lost Oboro and could have lost Shoyuta too if Oboro hadn't acted just in time to send Shoyuta flying out of the collapsing building with the kid they went to rescue. That loss had shaken them all in ways they hadn't known they could be. Trauma tended to suck like that, and as a response to it, they had all firmly locked down on each other. Whereas everyone else in their class drifted apart in their mourning, he, Shoyuta, and Namiri became attached at the hip and fully dragged Tensei into their fold and spent nearly every day with each other after school. Not that they used Tensei to replace Oboro. No one could replace him. But after losing one of their best and closest friends in such a horrid way, a lot of their inhibitions in fully befriending Tensei had been wiped away. And Hizashi would never regret the years and years of friendship they had built between the four of them. Still, though, as he sat with his three friends, he couldn't help longing for Oboro to be sitting with them, to see how the years would have aged him, though Hizashi was sure it wouldn't have changed him that much over time. At the very least, Hizashi was sure Oboro was happy they stayed so close and didn't drift apart after his death. "Hey, Zashi. Zashi, don't tell me your tolerance has gotten worse since we last saw each other," Tensei asked, waving one of his hands in front of his face, bringing Hizashi out of his thoughts. Hizashi snorted. "Nah, I could still drink you under. Just got lost up here," Hizashi told him, tapping his forehead. "So what were we talking about?" Hizashi asked, only to regret it when Namiri smirked at him. "Oh, nothing much. Just how your Midoriya's number 3 hero," Namiri playfully answered. Hizashi felt flush at the reminder, but he snorted and quickly pointed towards Shoyuta. "I may be the little guy's number 3, but Sho here is his favorite," Hizashi pointed out, making Shoyuta groan, and his head hit the table. "Don't remind me," Shoyuta growled, his face still firmly planted on the table. "Well, considering he's probably going to be one of Tenya's teachers next year, I was actually hoping to know a little more about the kid," Tensei told them. Hizashi smiled and placed a hand on Tensei's shoulder, chuckling about how much of a mother hen his friend could turn into when it came to his little brother. "You don't have to worry about the little speedster, Ten. Midoriya is great with the kids, and Tenya will definitely learn a lot from him," Hizashi promised. Namiri snorted. "Oh, Midoriya is a little more than great considering the year-wide protest the kids had for him during the festival this year," Namiri commented. Tensei chuckled himself. "Can't believe we missed it live. The third years were great, but I wish I could have seen that in protest in person," he told them. "It certainly shook things up, that's for sure." "What did Tenya think of it?" Hizashi asked, sipping on his glass. Tensei chuckled a bit more awkwardly as he rubbed his neck. "Actually, Tenya hasn't watched the first year section this year," Tensei said, and Hizashi didn't have to look at Namiri and Shoyuta to know that they were also looking at Tensei. "Why?" Shoyuta questioned for them. "Well, you see, it took a lot of convincing to get Tenya to watch the third years with me. He wanted to just study, and when I was going to watch the first years later, he told me he wasn't going to watch it because of the protest," Tensei awkwardly explained before holding his hands up. "It wasn't about the reason, I swear. He didn't even know why there was a protest, just that the first years wouldn't use their quirks and refused to compete honestly." His words. Tensei elaborated further. Hizashi stared at Tensei, his mouth opening and closing before he managed to ask, how did Tenya learn about the protest, but not why there was a protest? Pretty sure he didn't look into himself since he went right back to studying afterwards. But he did tell me he overheard some of the kids talking about how crazy it was to not use their quirks in protest. Tensei answered. "And he didn't hear what the protest was about from the other kids?" Namiri said in disbelief. Tensei shook his head. "Tenya doesn't want to eavesdrop and doesn't really talk with his peers. And he hasn't paid much attention to the news lately either with all of the studying he's been doing for the last couple of years," Tensei told them with a shrug. Wait. Does Tenya not know about Midoriya being a teacher? Like at all?" Hizashi questioned. Tensei blinked, thinking about it. You know what I don't think he does? Tenya would have definitely said something about how inappropriate it would be by now. Tensei said, looking just as confused about his brother's lack of knowledge as they were. How? Just how? Namiri asked, not looking at any of them. Midori has been all over the news, and the only thing people have been talking about aside from All Might moving to part-time, she exclaimed. I'll make sure to bring it up to Tenya when I get back. I wouldn't want him to have a misunderstanding if he runs into Midoriya once he starts at UA. Tensei said, shaking his head. No, don't tell him anything. Shoyuta told Tensei, and now it was time for the three to look at Shoyuta confused. If the ankle biter ain't going to do even basic research, then he deserves to be in the dark. Shoyuta argued. But what if he ends up in Midoriya's class and does something dash? Tensei tried to ask, but Shoyuta waved his hand dismissively. Midoriya's got thick skin. Ain't anything your brother will do that'll get under his skin, and if your brother does try to start shit, then Midoriya will out him in his place. Shoyuta said, setting down his glass. Namiri sighed. I hate to say it, but I kind of agree with Sho. She told them, face-palming. You can't police Tenya's behavior forever or always tell him how to act. And it might not be the best memory for him, but sometimes the best way to learn will be to mess up. Namiri told Tensei. Tensei sighed, letting his head rest on his hands. Yeah, you and Sho are probably right. Just please don't be too hard on him. He doesn't react well to surprises. Tensei pleaded with them. As long as he ain't blatantly quirkist or outright malicious, then he'll be fine. Shoyuta replied, rolling his eyes. Wait, do you think he'll be in Sho's homeroom or Midoriya's next year? Hizashi asked. Namiri hummed, around at the bar, says Sho. Namiri bet, offering her hand. Hizashi grinned, holding his hand out, and shook Namiri's bet. Hizashi agreed, while Shoyuta grumbled about them being idiots as Tensei laughed. As if Shoyuta wouldn't be singing along with them in the taxi back to the apartment. Thank you for joining us on this journey through What If Villain Deku Became a Teacher at U.A. We hope you found it as captivating as we did. A big thank you to Bloomerbill for creating such an engaging story. Don't forget to visit their profile on fanfiction.net for more fantastic works. The link is in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Zenin Fanfics for more intriguing explorations into fanfiction and fantasy. Your support helps us create more content like this, and we love hearing your thoughts and suggestions in the comment section. See you soon in the next video.